There's always a little suspense to how good is it going to be. But I think I'm in good hands with Ryan and Miguel.
Changes made during the process of adaptation can still be faithful to the source material and are almost always necessary. Every Game of Thrones show has at times improved upon the original text, House of the Dragon included. Fire and Blood was written with unreliable narration in mind, and it gives a lot of leeway for interpretation. But sadly, some of the writers have exploited that leeway. Look, you're allowed to like something even if you haven't read the books. Sometimes it's just easier. I don't believe in gatekeeping stuff, and I'm not an astute intellectual. I sometimes have to force myself to read, and it's easier after a long day of work to just sit down and watch stuff. I personally didn't even mind the Rings of Power show, but I acknowledge that if I, like many Lord of the Rings fans, had read all the relevant source material and were familiar with the world, my opinion would undoubtedly change. And I would not be trying to argue that the show is good in spite of all their criticisms. And if you can recognize that reading a book will drastically change your opinion on a series, is it really an opinion worth holding on to? Look, you can enjoy the show, or any show, without reading the source material. You have every right to, but it doesn't give you any grounds to argue in support of it. Art criticism and our fundamental ability to gauge artistic quality is based in how we observe one piece of art in comparison to the surrounding works within its genre or medium. Think of Tropic Thunder and how Simple Jack became the best movie in the history of cinema to a bunch of people who'd never seen another movie in their lives. So yeah, you might enjoy Hot D more if you haven't read the books, just as you might think that Transformers Rise of the Beasts was the best movie ever made if you'd never seen another movie in your life.
Let him know who you are. Yo, Scourge!
You don't know what you're missing, so you don't know the original story's themes and intentions, and it becomes impossible for you to understand how Hot D is failing to relay them to you. The aim of this video isn't to completely slander House of the Dragon. At times you will see me praise the show, but more often you'll see me criticize it. But there's still a failure to understand the material, and changes to the source material is a large part in what brought us to this critical juncture in HBO's most successful yet most divisive franchise. So how did we get here? An explosive public conflict between author George R.R. Martin and Hot D showrunner Ryan Condal, a steep drop-off in critical response between seasons 1 and 2, a deep primal fear grasping at our very souls as we watch a historical reenactment of the single biggest fall from grace in the history of the entertainment industry. We have played these games before, and we're not getting any better at them. Oh wait.
Sit. Eat.
What the fuck is going on?
A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. That is why we're here. We got a good Game of Thrones thing, and it brought to light how big of a fuck up Hot D really is. Alright, so I'm adding in a little disclaimer up front because this video finds itself in a really difficult position. I began writing this in March, but it's taken so long to make that Season 3 not only premiered, it finished before I got to release this. So I've been reworking the video week by week to integrate new Season 3 developments as they come out. But at a certain point, I just had to say enough. So while this video absolutely includes everything from Season 3 will also be getting an entire video to itself for a full addressment in Part 2. There are areas where I do think Season 3 has addressed some of the criticisms made in this video, but there are more areas where they've just doubled down on the mistakes. There might be certain points where you think, well, Season 3 has addressed this criticism, but if I've left it in this video, that means I don't believe it has, and I will explain that in Part 2.
Do you want some hard salt beef?
Oh, Meg, I can't eat hard salt beef.
The public tension between George and Condal might seem like an average Tuesday on the set of a Francis Ford Coppola movie, but considering the downfall of Game of Thrones and Martin's refrain of ever speaking too ill of the show even to this day, the fact that he's now vocalizing his concerns so publicly is quite shocking to those of us who've been following his career for so long. He had nothing but praise for Season 2's production when visiting the set, but later in May of 2024, we got the first hints of his frustration. No matter how major the writer is, no matter how great the book, there always seems to be someone on hand who thinks they can do better, eager to take the story and improve on it. The book is the book, the film is the film, they will tell you, as if they're saying something profound. Then they make the story their own. They never make it better though. 999 times out of 1,000, they make it worse. After Season 2 premiered, he took to his blog again, hinting at the disappointment for the changes made to a very memorable moment from the books, Blood and Cheese. There's a lot to be said about that, but this is not the place for me to say it. The issues are too complicated. Somewhere down the line, I'll do a separate post about all the issues raised by Blood and Cheese and Maelor the Missing. In his next post, he goes on a massive rant about the nature of dragons in fiction, and at the end, he notes that you'll never find his dragons roaming around in the wilds in areas like the Vale. This would become very relevant later on, when wild dragons randomly start appearing in the Vale. He ended that post by saying fantasy needs to be grounded. It's not simply a license to do anything you like. Smaug and Toothless may be dragons, but they should never be confused. Ignore canon and the world you've created comes apart like tissue paper. End of August, things start ramping up. I need to write about everything that's gone wrong with House of the Dragon, and I will. Then on September 4th, he made the infamous blog post, Beware the Butterflies. This post goes into detail about the butterfly effect in relation to his work. Maelor the Missing, a seemingly minor character from the books, had been erased from the show, but George illustrates just how much this change will ripple through the story. But we need to know more about the show before we can get into it. All you need to know right now is that Maelor, while seemingly a minor character, has a huge knock-on effect in the show. George explains how Condal assured him that Maelor hadn't been cut. His birth was pushed to Season 3, which creates problems of its own. But somewhere down the line, he was then cut entirely without George knowing. After airing all his issues with the butterfly effect from this change, he ends the post warning us that there are more toxic butterflies to come. This post was controversial, to say the least, so much so that HBO made him take it down and their PR jumped on it immediately. Commonly, when adapting a book for the screen with its own format and limitations, the showrunner ultimately is required to make difficult decisions about characters and stories that the audience will follow. Friend of George R.R. Martin and fellow author Jiranjay Zhao took to Tumblr after this post to expose what was actually going on. Her post is crucial to understanding what was happening, though suspiciously, it received a lot less coverage in the media. Here are the key points from her post. Creators are not the ones with power. Even an author as big as George gets their opinion dismissed if the higher-ups don't want to listen. Zhao met with George several weeks before he had made the post, and she said that the post he wrote, by comparison, was very mild to the concerns he spoke about with her. He was holding back a lot, and he wasn't going full scorched earth because he wanted to maintain professionalism. But he had to go public to get HBO's attention once they started ignoring him, and there was a lot worse he could have said. We also got a response from Elio Garcia, one of George's co-writers who works very closely with him on various history books and gives him general advice on the novels. It was extremely insightful and again received a lot less coverage in the media. He said that George fought tooth and nail to convince the execs and writers why their choices were potentially disastrous for the show's future, but his plea fell on deaf ears. He's at his wit's end, but he had refused to give up on saving it. Soon after all of this, we got a House of the Dragon podcast interviewing Ryan Condal, and this was just really poor form. It was done badly. It never acknowledges or addresses George's posts directly, but it's basically making Condal sit down with these very easygoing interviewers who frame all their questions to make him seem like a victim, and they never really have the balls to acknowledge George's discontent.
But I wonder, like, have you thought through, or maybe you've even lived through, like, someone coming up to you on the street or whatever and just being like, this did not happen in the book and I'm upset about it. Like, how do you envision that conversation with, you know, a book reader who is a fan who maybe doesn't like some of the choices that you've made?
I mean, thankfully, I've been very lucky. I'm a fairly generic white guy, so.
So if a fan was to approach you and air some grievances, yeah, that sounds a lot better than if the author responsible for your success took issue with you lying to his face. How would you respond? The response from Condal is and always will be stonewalling criticisms by regurgitating the definition of an adaptation and the challenges of it, regardless of whether those challenges actually justify the choices made in the show. 6 months later, Season 3 began production, and enough time had passed for Condal to give a public response to Martin directly. I will simply say that I've made every effort to include George in the adaptation process. I really did. Over years and years, we really enjoyed a mutually fruitful, I thought, really strong collaboration for a long time. But at some point, as we got deeper down the road, he just became unwilling to acknowledge the practical issues. At the end of the day, I just have to keep marching on. Not only the writing process forward, but also the practical parts of the process forward for the sake of the crew and cast. So I can only hope that George and I can rediscover that harmony someday. For a long time this was the last word on the matter, but almost a year later, not too long ago in fact, George R.R. Martin did an interview with The Hollywood Reporter and it aired all their dirty laundry in the middle of a very busy road. When asked how his relationship with Condal became so rocky, he replied, "It's worse than rocky, it's abysmal. I thought Ryan and I were partners, and we were all through the first season. I would read early drafts of the scripts, I would give notes, he would change things, it worked really well." And then we get the reveal about Miguel Sapochnik, who was the co-showrunner with Condal in season 1. He supposedly left the show by choice, but it was later revealed that he had been fired due to his attempt to force his wife into a more influential role as a producer and a character on the show. She was this random background maid for a few episodes of season 1 and had no prior experience either in front of or behind the camera. But in this interview, Martin revealed that the departure was more complex. The two showrunners had a lot of creative differences, and Martin reveals that he backed Condal during these disputes. Ryan asked for Martin's support in their dispute, and he got it. Sapochnik left the show after season 1. So this is kind of, straight up implying that Martin was the deciding factor in the dispute. Then we got into season 2 and he basically stopped listening to me. I would give notes and nothing would happen. Sometimes he would explain why he was doing it, other times he would tell me, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'll think about that." It got worse and worse until I began to get more annoyed. Finally, I got to a point where I was just told by HBO that I should submit all of my notes to them and they would give Ryan our combined notes.
I will simply say that I made every effort to include George in the adaptation process. I really did.
George then refers back to the blog post that got taken down, Beware the Butterflies, claiming that he wanted to put it back up but it would have looked stupid, and it was also meant to be one of 6 posts detailing all his issues with the show. The quotes from George stop there, but the article then mentions a reliable HBO inside source that discusses it further, who says the relationship deteriorated and it came to a head during a Zoom call with the show's producers and some HBO execs. The purpose of the call was for Condal to present his vision for season 3, and after Condal spoke, Martin detailed his many objections and allegedly declared, "This is not my story any longer." HBO asked Martin to step back from it altogether. George and Ryan had a disagreement on the direction of season 3, and at that point it was clear that communication had broke down completely.
It's always a little apprehensive when you turn your baby over to foster parents, but I'm involved in this.
I really admire how George has handled this conflict. After watching helplessly as the Game of Thrones showrunners, who he also handpicked and made the careers of, eventually disregard him and create what was arguably the most catastrophic downfall in modern pop culture, he made every effort to avoid that moving forward and maintain professionalism. For a creative person to suffer through all that, only to see it happen again, and only voice his discontent publicly when no other option was available, takes real restraint and maturity. So while you might have seen more explosive controversies in Hollywood, when you understand Martin's position, this is the equivalent to some of the most notorious behind-the-scenes conflict in television. He risked lawsuits to have his voice heard, and the fact that HBO became so uncooperative with the man responsible for their biggest, most profitable franchise to date is rather upsetting. It's perplexing to see a studio as revered as HBO make the same mistake again, the biggest mistake, and Hot D wasn't even the first time they repeated it. In the earlier post from Elio that we mentioned, he went into more detail about the last failed Game of Thrones spin-off, Blood Moon. This got cancelled after the pilot because it was an absolute mess. George had told them that it would be, but they tried to move forward with it anyway and learned the hard way that he was right. So they pivoted and had George more involved with productions moving forward. House of the Dragon was his own personal pitch, for which he handpicked Condal to run. He invested a huge amount of time and effort in developing Hot D alongside him, but as Elio points out, his contract with HBO means he doesn't legally have any real creative control over any of the spin-offs, and any involvement is essentially a courtesy. Alright, so emotions can run kind of hot for some people with this stuff, clearly, and it's easy to kind of simplify conflicts into black and white and right and wrong. But if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you know it's never that simple. I'm going to make some pretty scathing criticisms of Condal in this video, but it's important to keep in mind that he has been a fan of George's work for over 20 years. He became friends with him and he got to work on his dream job because of him. So do I think he actively tried to disregard the source material and betray his friend? No. At the end of the day, Condal has to stick up for his team and his work, and that's part of his job. And he's always going to be at a disadvantage when it comes to responding, because he lacks the same massive vocal fan base that George has. And every time he gives a response, it prompts more outrage. I mean, just look at this video. All he said was a couple of lines about budget and practical limitations and adaptation, and it was enough to provoke a feature-length crash out from me. If he started digging into the specifics and addressing every criticism, it would quickly spiral into a back and forth that he could never win. And even if he wanted to, HBO probably wouldn't let him. Compromises had to be made, communication broke down, and regardless of who made the wrong move first and most often, it would never be allowed to happen under the right production company. First and foremost, this is the failure of HBO, who can't hire a team of people that they don't have to constantly fire or cover with PR initiatives. It is inexcusable that they have not learned their lesson from Game of Thrones. Now, all that being said, there is a blatant disregard for the source material here from Condell and the writers, and I think members of the production and writing staff have exposed an ignorance and a hubris, which clearly makes them a bad match for this type of series. Ryan Condell and his writing staff are not victims here. But look, there is a lot to like in the show. I think anyone who says it's 100% bad is immediately discrediting themselves. If someone like me can be this angry at something, it has to involve some element of love. I mean, look at The Last of Us. The sequel wouldn't have been nearly as controversial if the original had been a middling, forgettable game. Hot D has some great talent behind it in most places and helped launch the careers of many of our generation's best new talent. But I think Seven Kingdoms has just been the final straw for a lot of people, myself included. When you can do so much more with so much less, it really brings the faults of Hot D into the spotlight, and to see Season 3 get such good reviews infuriates me. And it's just like I said in one of my previous videos, it's the complete death of independent thought. I think if most people who give these reviews went back and watched the early seasons of Game of Thrones, they'd be giving the show a lot less credit, I promise you that. But look, it's all a very messy situation, and it appears that Condell and Martin have a completely different understanding of the term adaptation at a fundamental level. So what is the nature of House of the Dragon as an Adaptations expose themselves to quite a few different forms of criticism, but we're not going to judge a piece of work exclusively based on faithfulness to the text. An adaptation can make extensive changes to the material and still be faithful to its essence.
My go-to answer of what makes a good adaptation was keeping the soul of the story, but adapting it to the new medium.
Keep the essence, make changes where necessary. There are a lot of different theories around adaptation, but Condell adapts the adaptation as rewriting theory, which sees adaptation not simply as a process of transferring content across mediums, but rather one of rewriting the story that gives birth to something new. This is not what George signed on for, and this is where the problems come in. Game of Thrones was originally an adaptation as interpretation, before abruptly swerving into rewriting, but then they ran out of source material. The primary challenge for David Benioff and D.B. Weiss became figuring out what to cut, whereas House of the Dragon and Seven Kingdoms have the challenge of what to add in. Seven Kingdoms manages to do this well, to the approval of author, critics, and audiences. House of the Dragon didn't, so what's gone wrong?
But unlike A Song of Ice and Fire, A Knight of Seven Kingdoms, Fire and Blood is a history book. It is a history described by three unreliable narrators. There are intentional holes in this historical fabric. That's part of the fun and the way that it was written. The what and the who and the when is usually there for you, but rarely the how and the why. And if there is a how and a why, it's usually disagreed upon by these three different sources. Yeah. Again, an intentional aspect of how this book was written and meant to entertain the fans.
The book is the book, the film is the film, they will tell you, as if they are saying something profound. Alright, there's a lot wrong with what's being said here. The nature of the text presents a challenge to anyone adapting it, yes. If you weren't able to work closely with the guy who wrote the entire thing, but you did. And eventually you started ignoring him. Compromises must be made, that is obvious, and George can be very stubborn when it comes to compromise. But compromise cannot account for poor writing.
The difference between Fire and Blood and House of the Dragon is largely, if you look at the story of World War II versus a movie about World War II. If you were looking at a book that covered the history of World War II, it begins at the beginning, you know, the Nazis taking Poland, and then it ends with VJ Day. No movie is going to cover all of that time. It's going to pick a specific span of time and a specific point of view and a specific subjective story within that. And that's the way we've really approached that, is that we are telling a subjective story that happens within this massive objective history. That is what we think helps to make this different and interesting and different from the book.
Alright, this is a load of waffle. The analogy is not applicable here. World War II is real history. You can make up whatever you like to fill the gaps between recorded events, but if your story was to encompass the fate of multiple nations and world leaders active during World War I, then you would need to adhere to some historical accuracy. Or else you just become a movie like The King's Man, which is just World War I fan fiction.
And your name? Adolf Hitler.
The Dance of Dragons is a fictional history, but unlike the real world, it's written by an author who integrated themes, character arcs, dramatic structure, and an overarching story. The same cannot be said for real-world events. The subjective story comes from the book's use of conflicting historical accounts, yes, but the show removes that element. So you are now, by definition, telling the objective truth of that story to the audience. And diverging from the book to the point where the story and characters are completely cut or changed extensively means abandoning the narrative completely. Cutting out characters who have chapters dedicated to their story or changing the nature of major events cannot be accounted for by simply saying, well, there's conflicting accounts. Movies like American Psycho or Children of Men prove that good adaptation does not necessitate strict adherence to the text, but we are veering into late Game of Thrones territory here, keeping the literal endpoint the same and taking a nonsensical route to get there. Having the Great Council vote come down to Rhaenys and Viserys instead of Rhaenys and Laenor like in the books better frames the narrative within the patriarchal structure and provides a foil for Rhaenyra, so this is a good change. Sometimes a change can even be better than the original story. George has even admitted this himself. Viserys was barely even a character in the book, he was just like a fat guy who loved partying, but from his added depth we gain innumerable benefits. His relationship with Daemon and Rhaenyra play into their development, and his physical condition offers a mirror to Aegon later on. Oberyn Martell is another example. Pedro Pascal added a charisma and a charm to the Dornish prince that just wasn't present in the text. George has commended Dan and Dave and Condal for their additions to Game of Thrones and Hot D at various points, like the scenes with Renly and Loras or with Littlefinger, scenes that aren't in the text. Making Shay have feelings for Tyrion instead of it being a transactional relationship, and giving Arya and Tywin their own little story, are arguably improvements to the original material, but when changes severely impact the plot and characters to the extent that the story can no longer communicate why it's important to begin with, there's no longer any point in caring about these characters because you've defeated the purpose in telling their story. HBO's desperate attempt to cover their asses with the amount of production missteps can be suffocating. For years, they've been producing these companion pieces like behind-the-scenes featurettes inside the episode, the weeks ahead, post-episode podcast discussions, documentaries on how it was made. Combine all of this with the YouTubers and podcasters who've built a career around analyzing these shows, and you'll end up with hundreds of hours of content per episode designed to flood your mind with information and hinder your ability to form your own opinion. They want to release an episode, then have you watch 7 different types of bonus content explaining how and why it's good. That way you're not really thinking about whether any real changes were made and what the repercussions of them could be. Watch some of these featurettes and you'll realize how absolutely devoid of substance they really are.
He sees that he is not the player, but a piece on the board.
Larys and Aegon basically escaped King's Landing because shit's about to hit the fan.
The camera is constantly circling characters.
In order for Aegon to be accepted by the people, you have to put him in front of the people and show them that he's their king. And call him king in front of the people so that the people will accept that that is Aegon their king.
I mean, he's a White Walker, which is cool. I was like, come on, that's cool.
Watch them try and explain Aemon and Alicent kissing. I haven't seen anything, but I bet you any money they explain that away to Kingdom Come on a fucking podcast or something.
I think Alicent has always thought that there's something more malignant with the feelings that Aemon has towards his mother, but didn't ever think that they would manifest.
The writing that we do on the show is always available to him. The things that we create and do.
Then we got into season 2 and he basically stopped listening to me.
And I've always taken aboard his feedback wherever possible.
I would give notes and nothing would happen.
There are, of course, places where we have not agreed and departed.
It got worse and worse, and I began to get more annoyed. Clearly, there are some conflicting accounts here. What is this? Fire and Blood? Kill me. Maybe it's just Condal adapting the truth by filling out the gaps between big moments by making stuff up. I don't doubt that George wants to go big more times than possible, but as his blog posts have made clear, the frequency of battles and big stuff is not the core problem. Condal's team have proven they're capable of making good changes, faithful to the essence of the story, but all of that feels redundant when you insist on making so many worse ones, and when you begin to add new stuff, it feels undeserved and a waste of time. There's no point adding niche little details when you can't nail down the basics. The show's version of the Velaryon sigil is a great example of the wider problems. Alright, you're gonna think I'm nitpicking, but just hear me out. This thing kind of drives me insane. I feel like it perfectly symbolizes the problems with this show as an adaptation. On its own, the sigil, it doesn't look bad, but it misses the point. It's meant to be a seahorse, not a literal sea horse, and this seemingly doesn't seem to make a difference to the average viewer, right? But it's meant to represent a creature not unlike a dragon, because Velaryons hail from old Valyria like the Targaryens. And it's more fitting with Corlys's name as a sea snake. George actually confirmed years ago that the design team misunderstood it when they were creating the sigil for season 1, but I don't really know how you can misunderstand the concept of a seahorse and end up making a horse mermaid. The The Valarian armor and costumes are always so good. They're just appealing to the eyes and they look cool, but I can never fully appreciate them because they have this fucking horse mermaid stuck in the middle of them. And it's the same feeling with Hot D. There's so many cool elements and cinematic techniques, but it makes it all the more annoying when you're reminded by a fundamental flaw or a massive diversion from the source material. D&D got a lot of hate, and yes, they did make many mistakes, but to an extent, I almost sympathize with them. In their defense, they did run out of source material. Martin failed to deliver the ending, and they also had very little experience going into Game of Thrones. They developed a formula that did a great job of adapting the material when they had the material to go off. When you look at Ira Parker, showrunner for Seven Kingdoms, discussing his approach to adaptation, there's clearly a better understanding between author and adapter as to the nature of the text.
It was very important to have a faithful adaptation. I think George said that phrase to me about 7 times in the first 3 minutes of our meeting in Santa Fe. So I knew what priority number 1 was.
But for the sake of impartiality, I will admit there are a few cuts and changes in Seven Kingdoms that do bother me. We won't get into all of them here, but one that I do find particularly heartbreaking was cutting this particular line about a knight who remembered his vows. It's the single best moment in the story. It's a small moment, but it pretty much sums up Dunk as a character at this point. And when I was watching the episode and I realized they'd skipped it, I had to immediately go and Google this like a little loser. And what I found was Ira Parker in an interview admitting that he made a mistake and it had been cut somewhere along the way without him realizing. Look at that. Look how much less angry I am when a showrunner just comes out and says, you know what? Yeah, that was on me. That was a mistake. It's quite a nice feeling when someone actually takes accountability for their actions instead of parroting on about the nature of adaptation. Don't get used to that. Now, this departure from the source material has led to the most crucial reason as to why House of the Dragon doesn't work.
I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude.
Or are you a dude who has no idea what dude he is and claims to know what dude he is?
What the fuck are you guys talking about?
House of the Dragon has no fucking idea what it's meant to be. From the outset, it never understood what it was setting out to do. You can't have your cake and eat it too. But it's obvious since day one that Condell and his team have tried to have 2 cakes, and both are underbaked. The writers never fully committed to the idea that Hot D is its own story, nor the idea that it's a soft reboot. And don't shoot the messenger, they'll tell you themselves.
How do we make thrones but not thrones?
We're not trying to rehash the past, we're trying to find something fresh and exciting.
But there was this very strong feeling that we wanted the audience to feel they're in the same show.
Game of Thrones was its own thing, but this is something else, it's a different story.
This is starting to become a pure Game of Thrones story now.
I hope fans will get everything that they got out of Game of Thrones.
I hope that audiences are open to watching a new chapter.
Knowing that you're watching Game of Thrones.
We wanted to very much embrace the feel and the world of Game of Thrones.
Ira Parker can sum up Seven Kingdoms in a sentence.
We are essentially the Hound and Arya of the TV show. That odd couple pairing, Brienne and Pod.
Whereas Condell can't explain what House of the Dragon is in 250 characters or less.
The difference between Fire and Blood and House of the Dragon is largely, if you look at the story of World War II versus a movie about World War II. Right. If you're looking at a book that covered the history of World War II, and that's the way we really approach that, is that we are telling a subjective story that happens within this massive objective history. So we can't possibly cover all of the events, but that doesn't mean the events don't happen. It just means that they're not happening on screen. Even though you're seeing a small window into it, it's happening on this massive canvas where all these other events are all happening at once at different times in different places.
It's a new story, but one they constantly compared to the original. Fire and Blood is intentionally reminiscent of the mainline novels. That's why it was a frontrunner for the first spin-off series. To deny the similarities is futile. We have a dragon-riding Targaryen princess who aspires to rule, often with Dany's theme underscoring her scenes, the charismatic king who prefers partying to ruling, the devious calculated hand from a powerful house, and the 2 main schemers, one that will grasp for power by any means necessary, with a creepy obsession with a female lead, while the other comes from the east and uses their understanding of the small folk to expand their network, and one of them suffers a physical impairment which strengthens their resolve. There's the petulant boy king and the old Kingsguard commander who throws down his sword in the face of corruption. The list can go on. And it will. The Kingsguard commander with questionable honor who fucks the queen from the Reach who threatens another queen standing, the closeted gay lordling who's skilled with a sword, the Lord of Riverrun being an old ailing man and his naive heir who must inherit the title, the bastard son with long brown hair who's rightful heir to the throne, the dangerous well-travelled second-born prince with ambiguous sexuality. Need I go on?
No.
The story centers around a conflict between 2 families which expands into civil war, pulling in all the great houses where the illegitimacy of the royal heirs leads to a disputed succession. It involves dragons and intrigue and sex and violence and an overarching story related to the Long Night. The Dance of Dragons is a historical parallel to the War of the 5 Kings and the surrounding events by design. In this scenario, you have 2 options. You follow the Game of Thrones formula or you break away from the format completely. How can this team expect us to view Hot B as its own thing after retconning a prophecy into the first episode called A Song of Ice and Fire, which is literally the name of the Game of Thrones books? A retcon that stresses the necessity of a Targaryen ruling a united realm in order to defeat the White Walkers, ignoring the fact that a Stark defeats the White Walkers while Lannisters rule over a divided realm in Game of Thrones. According to Condell and Sapochnik, the plan was to always start off with one family and then expand out. This gave Season 1 a little bit more individuality, though it still had its fair share of filler and forced brand cohesion, but the Shakespearean melodrama element came through. By Season 2, they'd blown out into a sprawling Game of Thrones epic fantasy, while neglecting to lay any of the foundations beyond the immediate family. This was clearly not thought through, and while the trajectory between first and second seasons is roughly the same in both shows, the varying routes that they take to get there make it impossible to carry equal impact.
I mean, I began with the story and the characters and the scene, and everything grew from that. But the world grew along with the story.
Game of Thrones starts with every character slowly spreading out and following their own path at a steady pace. Groups continue to divide, subplots branch into other subplots, and each one becomes a story in and of itself, with its own set of characters, settings, themes, and arcs. It developed a perfect formula for diverse storytelling with maximum viewer retention. As LFTS have explained in their video, each scene becomes a mini-story with a 3-act structure. Build tension, then cut to another story at the climax. It doesn't matter if you enjoy Jon's storyline at the Wall, because you'll be at court with Tyrion in less than 10 minutes. This is an on-screen translation of George R.R. Martin's writing style. A Song of Ice and Fire's books are structured in vignette-style chapters, taking place from one POV at one location. It will tell a sort of mini-short story before cutting to the next POV, and the scene composition of early Game of Thrones mirrored that style. Whereas Game of Thrones sticks with one character and their surrounding cast before cutting to the next, House of the Dragon will constantly jump back and forth in a very jarring manner where two scenes are spliced together and constantly interrupting one another. Yes, Fire and Blood is not written in the same style as the main series, but if you are adapting historical events into a dramatic narrative, you need to follow some kind of structure. And if you're going to copy Game of Thrones in every other conceivable way, you need to copy their formula. Look at Season 3, Episode 2, just as an example. First, we see Alicent in King's Landing trying to find the commander of the City Watch. Then we cut to Daemon returning to Dragonstone to meet with Rhaenyra after hearing about Luke's death. Daemon speaks with the Dragon Seeds, then has a conversation with Mysaria. And in the time it takes him to knock on the door and go and see Rhaenyra, we've already cut back to Alicent. Now she's wandering around the Red Keep, looking for the commander of the City Watch, who she just met. And by the time we cut back to Daemon, he's already met with Rhaenyra, and we're joining halfway through their discussion. Then we cut back to Alicent, where she's assaulted by Lord Jasper. Then back to Rhaenyra, who's now feeling better and prepares to fly to the Red Keep. Then they begin flying to the Red Keep, and we cut back to Alicent, who's now completely recovered from her assault and found Helaena. She'll go to the battlements and command the men to stand down. So what we've got here are two scenes that are both too long, and while they both have a trajectory where characters face obstacles and internal conflicts, they lose any sense of momentum or structure because they keep interrupting each other constantly. It's like they don't trust our attention spans to stay with them through a longer scene. They've completely destroyed the formula developed by early Game of Thrones, and that would be fine if you were committing to doing something different. A Song of Ice and Fire weaves a massive tapestry of interconnecting factions and characters from every corner of the world. Each of those corners demands attention and care to craft the bigger picture, but it's impossible to capture any such tapestry if you only fill out certain patches of the fabric and ignore the gaps in between.
Would you like to see the tapestry?
Glossing over the Starks and Aarons, the Baratheons, the Tullys and Lannisters withers the world. It'll waste time and money on characters that we're never going to care about because they've refused to flesh them out. And this presents an unsolvable problem for Hot D. Fire and Blood focuses on the broader points of history in relation to the Targaryens. It's fine to gloss over the surrounding details without getting too deep into their backstory, but in a television series, it makes the world feel shallow and the story rushed. This is a symptom of an identity crisis. You can go down the same route and essentially soft reboot Game of Thrones under a new context, but you have to offer the same commitment as the original in order to succeed. And this is completely doable and could live up to the original when properly executed. Or you could take the other route, adopt the Succession template. Confine your story to council rooms and keeps and watch the cast react to unfolding events as they're relayed to them rather than directly showing the events themselves. We'll lose some of the spectacle, but we become immersed through a tight focus where we feel like we're in the room with these people. Don't cut to Luke flying to Storm's End and being eaten by Vhagar. Follow Rhaenyra as she sends him off with a heartfelt goodbye. Then follow her into her next War Council meeting, arguing with Daemon. Explore her recovery from a miscarriage, debating with her counselors. Then break the tension with Daemon by having him relay word of Luke's death. An opposite approach, but equally impactful.
But omniscient viewpoint, I've never liked that as a reader. I think we don't experience, none of us are God. When we experience life, we see it through a particular viewpoint. So it makes a huge difference in whose viewpoint we tell that particular incident from. That's the way we experience life. That's the way we should experience fiction, I believe.
The death of Stalin covers a time period featuring mass murders and palace coups, and events that have nationwide ramifications, but it cuts around them, sticking to the perspectives of the Central Committee. And the result is a phenomenal film that doesn't leave you wanting for an omniscient view of events. You do either of these, but not both. In other words, pick a lane. Assimilate or innovate. The first option requires more time, more episodes, and more seasons, but it could absolutely work. The second option requires less money, less episodes, less actors and locations, and conveys a powerful standalone story centered around one family, a true Shakespearean melodrama, not a sprawling fantasy epic, one that would easily fit into 3 or 4 seasons without any unnecessary filler. We know that House of the Dragon Season 3 has a conceptual episode. Now, this episode will be released by the time you see this video, but what we know right now is it solely follows Rhaenyra's perspective as she attempts to handle the ruling responsibilities of King's Landing from the Red Keep. So obviously I haven't seen this, and it could be terrible, I don't know. But if it doesn't work, that doesn't mean the idea is bad. Obviously doing it once halfway through your 3rd season is a lot different than adopting it from the start and structuring your entire story and character arcs around that premise. But credit where credit is due, they're at least experimenting and trying new things. That's good, but it's a little too late. And look, I'm sure there are other ways to pitch this story. My idea is just one example. Don't get stuck at the fork in the road. The only thing worse than a wrong decision is indecision, and Hot D is learning that the hard way. The series has never understood its own nature since its inception. Is it a Game of Thrones story or a story set in the same world as Game of Thrones? It tries to walk 2 paths that cannot align. It kind of tried to branch out as a standalone story in Season 1, albeit not as much as it should have, but then it pivoted into the traditional Game of Thrones structure in Season 2, and now it's confined itself to a formula which it cannot operate within. Seven Kingdoms avoided this problem from its conception. The very first scene of Episode 1 slowly brings in the Game of Thrones theme, a faint echo that builds and builds and... We are told in plain English, this is not Game of Thrones. Everything you need to know is laid out right there in front of you in one moment. It sets the tone and direction for the story immediately. By contrast, Hot D begins with the Game of Thrones theme.
The only thing that could tear down the House of the Dragon.
Then transitions into the old Targaryen theme. And from then on, every episode copies the original opening credits. Seven Kingdoms would continually break the rules, a small, grounded story set around one event with 2 main characters and little deviation. No scheming, fewer morally ambiguous characters, and no branching subplots. Rather than fabricating the core narrative components of Game of Thrones that aren't present in the source material, it hones in on the core components from Game of Thrones that are most present in this story. Character, stakes, and action. Now, Dunk is a resounding good guy if there ever was one, albeit a little whitewashed from his book version, and the villain is indisputably evil, so how do you make that interesting? Firstly, you embrace the fact that this is a traditional story of good versus evil, rather than trying to deconstruct that story. Pop culture has fetishized moral ambiguity to the point where it almost feels more controversial to have characters who are genuinely good people. But in the last year, we've seen a few projects that can disprove that misconception. While people might have thought Ned or Jon were one-dimensional back in Game of Thrones, Hot D is exposing what happens when you don't have any real characters to root for. Secondly, you give him what I call the Captain America treatment. You take a morally unimpeachable hero who is kind of boring by modern day standards and force them into morally convoluted situations. As the next few seasons of Seven Kingdoms come out, the story will continuously remind us that no matter how likable and positive our heroes are, they're living in the world of Westeros, and it makes no exceptions. The first challenge in any of these spin-offs will always be, how does it compare to Game of Thrones? Hot D chose Delusion. The writers convinced themselves it could stand on its own, while also retreading the same ground. Seven Kingdoms chose to tackle the problem head-on. Once you accept the differences, you can address the issues and hone in on what makes your story tick in ways that others don't. Then, you can springboard into new ideas. We're not confined to the same formula, so why not break the rules a little? Use editing for comic effect in a way that could break immersion and give a nod to the audience.
Caravan departs after the roast. Baela of House Targaryen.
It's a risk, but it's one that paid off. You can use contemporary music, open an episode with a little jazz, rejig the color palette, get rid of all that drab grayness, change our cinematography style, use sudden cuts within the same scene, and truly break out of the vignette style and do your own thing.
He always meant for me to be a knight one day, as he was.
Am I to be a knight one day, sir? As you are?
This approach will eventually result in something that feels wholly original. Now, there is some filler in Seven Kingdoms and a few pacing issues, and some of the cut content did bother me, but I was able to overlook it all in the end because at its core it was faithful, original, and made with love for the source material. Duncan Egg always sort of reminded me of The Mandalorian. You know, you got this wandering warrior traveling the world alongside his child protege with a mysterious secret. And Mando's initial success came from telling smaller, episodic, intimate stories that stood out from traditional Star Wars. Whereas Hot D is kind of trying to do the prequels and the sequels at the same time. It's literally a prequel in the golden era where dynasties are at the height of their power, and there are attempts to blur the lines between good and evil more so than the original. They're trying to add more nuance to characters and plot points, but ultimately they both condense the riskier ideas to make room for the must-have moments, like the big space battles and the lightsaber fights. And all of this is true of House of the Dragon, but at the very least, the prequels had their own style and feel. They stood out from the originals and you'd never confuse them. Whereas Hot D tries to exploit our love for the originals by revisiting all the same locations and factions and retreading the same story beats and using similar character archetypes, much like the Star Wars sequels. And in both cases, they failed to execute on their ideas. The lack of identity really bleeds into one of the resounding criticisms of Season 2. People understand that the pacing is a problem, but no one understands how it actually hinders the show. It's not that it's too slow, it's more that it's too slow in places and too fast in others. Let's take the most famous example, Daemon at Harrenhal. We need to see Daemon make some sort of internal progress, and I think Harrenhal could be a great setting for that, but the plot drags on for way too long. Interestingly enough, much like Daemon, Arya spent most of her second season sequestered at Harrenhal, but it didn't feel like a drag because it gave her a structured arc that integrated other major characters and fleshed each of them out in turn. But more importantly, her story moved at the same pace as everyone else's. Daemon's realizations about himself and his subsequent change in demeanor happen almost immediately, and then it's repeated over and over again to reinforce what we already know. Meanwhile, Criston Cole has begun his campaign in the Crownlands, and in traditional Game of Thrones fashion, you'd expect this to sort of be his next big arc as a character, a subplot that spans the whole season, introducing characters like Gwaine Hightower and more of them. This is the time to look at Criston and how a young, naive boy from a barely recognizable house managed to ascend to this position of power. But 2 episodes later, Cole's back at the Red Keep, and none of that is explored. So one storyline feels rushed and the other feels too slow, and neither are very entertaining. The other reality about pacing that most people refuse to acknowledge is that it's not a Season 2 problem. It's been a problem since the beginning in Season 1. Some of the earlier and later episodes of Season 1 were grasping at the height of peak Game of Thrones, but many of the episodes in between are meandering and aimless. The story follows the breakdown of a family over many years, focusing on people and relationships, but it cuts out most of the moments that strengthen or weaken those relationships. Martin's original plan for the pilot began 40 years before the first episode we actually got, and while this seems counterintuitive, I actually think it would have helped consolidate the pacing.
I would have began it much earlier. I would have began it like 40 years earlier with an episode I would have called The Heir and the Spare, in which Jaehaerys' 2 sons, Aemon and Balon, are alive, and we see the friendship but also the rivalry between the 2 sides of the great house. And then, you know, Aemon dies accidentally when a Mirish crossbowman shoots him by accident. Then Jaehaerys has to decide who becomes the new heir. Is it the daughter of the older son who's just died, or is it the second son who's only, you know, has children of his own and is a man and she's just a teenage girl? You know, all of that stuff. So
Aemon and Balon would form a mirror for the future princeling brothers, Viserys and Daemon. Friends but also rivals, the younger one holding resentment for living in the shadow of his brother who was heir to the throne. And they would also be a mirror for Aegon and Aemond later on, emphasizing this cycle of familial discontent passed down between generations. And it also forms a mirror for Rhaenyra's situation and the idea of a controversial female succession. So you've got Balon and Aemon, Viserys and Daemon, Aegon and Aemond, and Flaenen and Shaenen and Blaena. This is all gibberish. I think the versions of this draft likely ended with the prologue that we actually got at the start of the real pilot, with the Great Council, and maybe it could have added more depth to Rhaenys' character as well. But according to Martin,
which was actually my favorite possibility, but nobody liked it except me. Yeah, I was the only one who was really enthused about that. So
this should have been his first hint. I think the pilot would have better served the story. Episode 1 could have acted as a prologue, and even when stories feature time jumps, they still need a rigid structure and tight pacing in order to work. When a story cuts to a time where everything has drastically changed, it can make the moments lost in between feel louder, when done properly. Danny Boyle's Steve Jobs movie follows the moments leading up to 3 different product launches that defined his career and personal relationships. Moonlight sets each act at definitive turning points in Chiron's life at the various stages of development in youth, and Andor groups each trilogy of episodes in a set time period, then jumps forward 1 year between sets of 3. By contrast, House of the Dragon jumps 6 months after episode 1, then 3 years, then 1 year, then a couple of months, then 10 years, back to a couple of months, then 6 years, and then 2 episodes taking place within 1 day. It's a mess. When we lose the structure, everything becomes messy, and we lose many important moments crucial to understanding the full story. The absence of Rhaenyra and Harwin's relationship is a prime example.
People have said that time jumps were jarring to them, and Rhaenyra's relationship with Harwin's strong. She had 3 children by him, but we never see them get together for the first time or kiss. We never have a scene when they first slept with each other. We don't know exactly what has happened and how he felt about that and how Laenor felt about him. There's a whole story there. There's at least a novella, and it did not fit the format of my history book. So, but it's a story, and I would love to do that.
The illegitimacy of these 3 strong boys is one of the main catalysts for the Dance of Dragons. It becomes a central point of focus in the latter half of the season, and changing the Velaryon ethnicity makes it ridiculously obvious. So we need to know how Rhaenyra, someone who up until this point has been portrayed as relatively intelligent, would allow this to happen in the first place. We need to see how love became the death of duty. But, you know, it's not like it was one of the main themes in the show that you're soft rebooting or anything. Pushing this love story off screen weakens the impact of Harwin's death, and it snubs a chance to flesh out Jace and Luke's characters. If you enrolled in film school tomorrow, I'd bet you any money that within the first 2 lectures you'd hear the phrase, "show, don't tell." But Hot D is hellbent on doing the opposite. We spend such little time with the inner lives of most of these characters. We never see how they approach whatever challenges the day may bring. We don't get the little moments that fill out their perspectives, and it makes it hard to judge what's important to the story sometimes. Daemon Velaryon has a justified claim on Driftmark in episode 8, and his outrage is understandable. But we know so little about him before this point. Pushing him to the side and only bringing him back when he's relevant to the plot simplifies the conflict between him and Rhaenyra. It basically just turns him into a plot point or a tool for another character's growth. The same pretty much goes for the entire Velaryon cast, except maybe Laenor. Laena expresses interest in Vhagar in episode 2, then expresses interest in Daemon in episode 5. The next time we see her, she has 2 children with Daemon and Vhagar. This is like listing out the bullet points of a story before you actually sit down and write it. We don't get to see how fatherhood affects Daemon at all, and the one scene he has with his daughters alone was cut from the show entirely. We skip through a major chapter in their lives. It would be easier to understand his pain had we ever known what he'd really lost through following that relationship a little longer, and getting over it so quickly kind of makes him seem even more of a villain than he already is. How can you expect us to engage with these people on a deeper level when we're only ever seeing the broader points of their life? It feels more like reading a history book in a season designed to adapt a history book into a real dramatic story.
Were you troubled by the time jumps and the castings, as some people say they were?
I wouldn't say troubled. I wish that we could have spent more time with everything and seen some of the relationships develop there. So I would have loved for it to be slower.
And episode 9 is a particular poor use of screen time. The Inside the Episode featurette wants to sell you on this idea that it's inspired by crime thrillers and it's a hunt for Aegon.
Because it's a thriller, it's a race against time.
And it sets off this race for both of them to find Aegon because each of them wants to influence him.
It's all nonsense. It's like a thriller, it's a race against time. Yeah, a race against time. Everyone wants to find Aegon and influence him. Influence him to do what? Alicent wants to find him first so she can convince him to offer lenient terms to Rhaenyra, but he ends up crowned either way. For this subplot to have any point, we need to see a follow-up scene after the coronation where Otto insists on killing Rhaenyra, but Aegon resolves to adhere to his mother's wishes. Then this whole hour-long fucking chase would have some point, but we never get that scene, so it basically makes the entire hunt feel redundant. Oh, but don't worry, it's a crime thriller. It's a race against time.
And I think that's the big mystery of the episode is, who is Aegon really? Who is this man we're about to make king?
Who is this man? Well, I don't know, but I guess if you just keep him off screen for most of the episode and then just chuck in a few lines about how he's a deviant, sadistic sex predator, I'll figure it out. Pacing also led to another big issue with season 1, which is the constant recasting. The recasting made this show less of a Game of Thrones and more of a game of Guess Who. We have some characters with 3 actors, others with 2, and others with 1. We arrive at a point where characters like Aemond, who weren't even born when Criston Cole was an adult, are portrayed by actors 2 years younger than Fabian Frankel by the end of the series. The same goes for Olivia Cook, who is only 2 years older than both of her sons by the end of the season in real life.
Did you know going in the age discrepancy that there would be between you and your sons on the show?
When I found out that Tom Glencarney was like auditioning for my son, I was like, what? I was like, are they going to like recast Alicent again?
Now, I guess you can't recast Matt Smith because he's the only A-lister. I mean, I don't think it would be that much of a problem to have a younger actor for the first 5 episodes, but it doesn't make it any less weird when he doesn't age a day for 20 years, while all the actors around him are jumping up 10 years in age between episodes. Then we have actors who barely look older than the younger versions of themselves, and some of them don't even look remotely similar. Like, a lot of normal people who just chuck this show on a Sunday probably aren't even going to be aware that these guys are the same person, especially when all the names are the same.
I don't know. I've been watching for 3 seasons. I don't know their names. Everybody is Rhaegon, Gunray,
Emond and Domond and Mormond and Rimond.
All them blonde, white-haired people look the same.
Everyone has blonde hair, so I'm completely lost.
It becomes incredibly difficult to develop an attachment to characters whose faces keep changing. Even if we ignore the external dissonance for many of the lead characters, there's also an internal dissonance, especially with Alicent and Rhaenyra's older and younger versions. Young Alicent has every right to be angry and fear for her standing in court, and young Rhaenyra has a certain fiery arrogance and a daring nature. But older Alicent has suddenly transformed into a manipulative, controlling bully, whereas Rhaenyra has completely lost her edge and learned to conform to gender expectations. It's not that it's unrealistic for either of these characters to reach these points. I think it's completely plausible, but it's also very jarring to swerve so abruptly from one end of the spectrum to the other. It makes it difficult to feel that the older and younger versions are one and the same. Let's look at Tyrion and Rhaenyra and their respective first season. Her story covers her entire life until now. Tyrion's covers roughly a year, but we feel like we've spent much more time with him by the end of it. It's the worst of both worlds. We've skipped major turning points in their lives, but we've also never seen a slice of life. And now the same is true for season 2. Too fast, then too slow. The actual story progression wouldn't feel nearly as slow if it weren't for scene repetition. Alicent and Rhaenyra go around in circles all through the story, having the same interactions and conversations with the same people. Alicent will express some kind of guilt and then worry about Helena and scold Aegon or Aemond, and Rhaenyra will lament about the patriarchy and a need for more dragons or a desire for unity, mostly with Mysaria but sometimes with Jace, usually in the same big empty room. Corlys and Alan will retread the same ground over and over and over. Daemon wanders around Harrenhal examining the same feelings of guilt and insecurity in every single dream, and the neglected alternatives stress the sluggish pace. You're going to hear me mention this a lot, but Jace's cut storyline in Winterfell would have fleshed out his character and offered a refreshing glance into the north during this part of the story. But instead, we get 2 Giga Chads mogging and mewing atop the wall. Stop mewing. They use an expensive CGI set that blows out the budget just for a bit of nostalgia baiting, because the show lacks identity and wants to reel you in with something familiar. Now if we look at Baela's character, instead of expanding on her character with the few scenes she's been given, they've wasted a chunk of her screen time on a pointless dragon chase, and most of the rest of it was consoling Jace, who we wouldn't have to console if he'd been at Winterfell. There were so many quotes from Condell and the writers in season 2 talking about how the second season was about the kids, but they're barely fucking in it. Stop mewing. The audience had snapped by the time of the finale. We waste so much time watching Tyrion Lannister wrestle in the mud with Loha. The whole sequence is undoubtedly the single worst thing of anything in this show before season 3.
I want you to fuck my wives.
It's just sheer cringiness. The fact that we're watching 2 tertiary characters roll around in the fucking mud in a show about a Targaryen civil war is pretty infuriating. We talked about show don't tell, right? But we're being told about Harwin and Rhaenyra's relationship. We're being told about Jace's time in Winterfell. We're being told about Otto in prison. We're being told about Daemon living in Old Town. But we're not showing them. Instead, we're showing this.
You're thin, but also tall.
Pacing doesn't come down to being slow. It's a misallocation of screen time and a symptom of trying to be Game of Thrones and a standalone Targaryen family story at the same time. Pacing can disrupt the entire story and it can make big moments feel small. This is why the Battle of the Stepstones felt hollow and why Rook's Rest felt sudden and why the first 2 episodes of season 3 are a little bit jarring because the pacing is fucked. They had to push the last 2 episodes of season 2 into season 3. You might think that explains why the pacing is bad, but it doesn't. It just exposes how bad they are at handling money and screen time. So we've established it's fair to compare Hot D to its predecessor. It largely follows the same structure and same overarching narrative. It also employs the same narrative devices. So I'm going to break down Game of Thrones into its core components and compare how it employs each of them in contrast to House of the Dragon. Now, broadly speaking, when I say Game of Thrones in a comparative sense, I'm mostly talking about the earlier seasons, 1 to 3, and sometimes 4, unless otherwise specified. Generally speaking, I would list the main ingredients as character authenticity, stakes, world building, action, and politics and intrigue. Each of these elements works in tandem with one another, crafting an elaborate, complex story on a grand scale. And look, we're comparing to Game of Thrones a lot, but even in its heyday, the show still paled in comparison to the original books in many ways, but it always kept the essence and respected the original work. That being said, it does sometimes lack the tact and subtlety of George's prose.
You once loved a woman many years ago, but it turned out badly, so you've never let yourself love again. Oh wait, that's me.
Yes, very subtle, Tyrion, thank you. Stop mewing. All of this is to say that Game of Thrones wasn't some divine television show that descended from the heavens. It can be guilty of the flaws I'm highlighting in Hot D, even in its golden era. But overall, the differences are night and day. Now I'd like to thank our sponsor for this video. No, wait, we don't have one. I spent 5 months of my life making this video for free. That's how butthurt I am over this show. Next section. Alright, so character is the heart and soul of everything in the franchise, and nothing else will work without this. Authentic characters need to be grounded and believable, regardless of setting. This enables us to resonate with them, develop an emotional attachment, and form a relationship. We need to care about the people in the story to have any desire to continue it. George is known for his ability to craft complex, morally grey characters. He balances flaws and redeeming values very well, fine-tuning even the most evil or heroic people as to make them that much more intriguing. On a spectrum of good and evil in the Game of Thrones world, you'll see characters like Ned and Jon on one end with Ramsay and Joffrey on the other, but many of the fan favourites fall somewhere in the middle. But on the extreme ends, we'll still find these characters compelling. Cersei is wicked and cruel, but she loves her children. She's a victim of domestic abuse and a victim of the patriarchy. So even though we hate her, we can empathize with her to an extent. Jon Snow resolves to always be honorable and risk his life for others.
It's fucking Jon Snow.
But he's also a snot-nosed little brat when we meet him compared to most of the small folk he's around. He breaks his vows, betrays his brothers, kills a fucking child, and when it comes to particularly one-sided villains like Joffrey or Ramsay, they're used sparingly. Ramsay doesn't come to the forefront until after Joffrey's death, and Cersei doesn't rise to prominence until after Ramsay's death. And usually they're a straw man for a more calculated, dangerous force of evil, at least earlier in the show. The extensive changes and additions in House of the Dragon all work to simplify characters. Seemingly complex individuals are whitewashed, robbed of accountability, or painted as wholly evil. This creates a black and white view of morality in a world famous for being morally grey. I've already mentioned our culture's fetishization of morally ambiguous characters, and Game of Thrones was certainly part of the cause, but Hot D is one of the symptoms. Looking at any main character, you'll often find that the writers don't focus on balancing flaws with redeeming values, but instead on showing you how they became someone who makes immoral choices, posing them as the victim of some other injustice as to make you sympathize. Now, this is an essential narrative device when crafting 3D characters, but it cannot craft them on its own, because ultimately we have to take responsibility for our own actions. But on the other hand, when a character is presented as too good, it becomes harder to engage with them. Let's start with Rhaenyra and Alicent. Now, I'd like to reiterate that I'm in no way critiquing the on-screen talent. I actually find almost every actor in the show to be immensely talented and well-suited to the role. Many of the problems we'll discuss here are much easier to digest because of the performances of actors like Emma Darcy and Olivia Cook. The inclusion of Aegon's prophecy has been a huge detriment to both of these characters, offering them a blanket excuse to hide behind whenever they want to do anything too morally questionable. From the beginning, it gives Rhaenyra more justification for her actions to a point. Even if we do believe she's a good ruler who deserves the throne, there should be a sense of jealousy and entitlement which the prophecy dilutes. We already empathize with her and root for her through her struggles with the patriarchal system, and we've seen enough of her leadership qualities to know she's earned her succession. But over time, she should become more obsessive over the throne, losing a little focus on how and why she deserves it, and fall victim to the same ambitions as so many have done before her. It seems like they're now introducing the madness element in Season 3, but again, like many things in this show, it's too little too late. And it's still somewhat anchored in the prophecy. The way Daemon convinces her to take the Red Keep is by bringing up Aegon's prophecy and the duty that she holds. But it would have been more interesting to see her find her own reasons for taking action, in spite of her grief, even if it's just being hell-bent on vengeance. The prophecy then becomes a tool to vindicate Alicent for betraying her closest friend, with this ridiculous whisper of Aegon's name during Viserys' death. The coincidence is a little too much, and I think if Viserys was going to mention anyone's name in his final moments, it would be Aemma, not some distant relative he never met. While writing Alicent, they chose to make her a bad mother, because that's morally grey. She's always neglected Aegon, and now she's repulsed by the result. There's no real motivation for her to crown him unless they can find a way to force her to that decision suddenly, which is partly why we have this scene with Viserys. But even then, it still doesn't really make sense. She's just restored her relationship with Rhaenyra, and I think she knows that this kill or be killed mentality that Otto's been pushing on her isn't true and there's no real threat. So to push her further down this path of crowning Aegon, they make her a helpless victim in the first Green Council meeting. So now she has no say in any of this, even though she goes on to acquire Aegon first and protects him from Rhaenys. It's so much back and forth, I get confused just describing it. But the flaw of being a bad mother isn't balanced with a redeeming quality. Instead, they pile on a bunch of scenarios that pose her as a helpless bystander, who feels compelled to act in the way she's being told to, through contrived scenarios. This marks a trend that you'll often find with these two characters. You can feel the writers telling you that we're meant to feel sorry for them, but they're not making a coherent case as to why we should. The writers changed both Laenor and Vaemon's death as to make Rhaenyra much more likable. Faking Laenor's death was ridiculously contrived, and it only makes sense if he's going to return later, but now Adam has claimed sea smoke, which means he's definitely died off screen, and this didn't happen in the book. Vaemon's death was also very different. In Fire and Blood, Rhaenyra demands Vaemon's head after he declares himself heir to Driftmark, and Daemon delivers it to her. Then when Vaemon's cousins make a plea to the king, he cuts out their tongues, children included. But in the show we get this Jerry Springer-esque scene with this ludicrous outburst. This kind of behavior is not something any of these characters would consider if they have a shred of intelligence, but the scene has a bunch of cool lines and tweetable moments, so it's okay. Now obviously Rhaenyra comes off as far too evil for the showrunner's opinion if they adhere to Vaemon's book death. But changing Laenor's death is more understandable, considering that Rhaenyra has to become allies with his parents. They're trying to show her as being a bit more moral by not killing him, but in the process, Daemon goes on this Assassin's Creed stealth mission and murders a bunch of guards who are completely innocent. There's much better ways to do this. Only one episode prior, Laenor was itching to return to battle after years of being docile, and war had once again broken out in the Stepstones. He could have impulsively sailed off to fight in the Stepstones as to avoid dealing with his grief, and then die in battle. This would remove Rhaenyra's culpability and provides a mirror for Corlys, who then sails to the Stepstones to avoid processing his grief for his children, and it would further emphasize Hot D's theme of parents passing down their sins to the next generation. I came up with that in like 2 minutes. How did a team of professional writers not come up with something better? The writers are crafting contrived scenarios to vindicate certain characters but make other characters look profoundly stupid in the process, even though we already empathize with Rhaenyra and Alicent. The main issues boil down to this: replacing moments of moral complexity with moments of empathy, but also shunning logical moments of empathy and devising new contrived ones. After Blood and Cheese, Alicent seems rather apathetic about her grandson's death. She has some concern for Helena, but outright avoids Aegon when she finds him weeping in his room. She just risked her life to protect Aegon like 1 day ago, but now she's back to neglecting him. This is the logical moment to lean into a moment of empathy. Alicent should be grief-stricken from the event, which finally pushes her to console her son and embrace her maternal duties towards him, even if it's too late to fix him. On the other side, we have Rhaenyra. Our final shot of her in season 1 has her looking like this. 1 episode later, she says this:
I want Aemond Targaryen.
And at the start of the next episode, she's doing this.
And they are accusing me of having a hand in this.
More confused than angry, more concerned about being blamed for the death of Jaehaerys. How do we go from this to this to this in 24 hours? Frankly, I was expecting her to be so consumed with rage and grief that none of this really registered with her, and she didn't care about the PR storm. If anything, this is a moment to lean into that narrative, a logical point to make her empathetic. Maybe it's good that people think I did this. Maybe they'll finally start to fear me and take me seriously. I would empathize with her more if she was mad with rage and grief here. We should be sharing that anger with her. But we've gone back to perfect Rhaenyra, restraining herself for the sake of saving the world from ice zombies in 200 years that have nothing to do with the Targaryens on the throne. We won't see any hint of her immorality until the Red Sowing at the end of the season. Speaking of which, Rhaenyra becomes determined to find new dragon riders to take on Vhagar because she's hell-bent on getting revenge against Aemond. So hell-bent that she'll watch innocent civilians burn to death during the Red Sowing without a shred of guilt. But at least we have something here, right? An actual moment of immorality. Now she's finally got her dragons and she can exact vengeance on Aemond for killing her.
I had hoped my advantage may be in deterrence.
No, never mind. We're back to being a hero. We need to save the world from ice zombies, even though that's in 200 years and the Targaryens have nothing to do with it. Obviously, this moment on the Dragamon is meant to hint at her growing madness, but it's the first trace we've ever seen of it. And again, too little, too late. Now at the start of season 3, her madness is coming out of absolutely nowhere, even though her first scene, chronologically, is taking place just a few days after the last one. You know, she's very wiry and a bit frantic, and it's obviously exacerbated moving forward after Jace's death, but it's too sudden and jarring. Stefan Darklin's death was another missed opportunity for this type of thing in season 2. The start of this scene has so much tension. This poor guy is being asked to sign his own death warrant under the veil of a request. There's a mounting pressure from Rhaenyra and her council staring him down, forcing him to do this under the pretense of duty to his queen. But in reality, they're just feeding him to a dragon. It's a great way to gradually introduce Rhaenyra's questionable morals as she grows more desperate, but instead, he relishes at the chance. It removes any potential accountability from her now that he's eager to do it. Stop mewing. The infamous Rhaenys scene in episode 9 best embodies this problem.
We needed a penultimate scene. Oh, well, it'll be the coronation, etc. And I just kept thinking to myself, we got to do better than this.
So they've invented a scene with two main aims. One is a desperate need to create action spectacle in a moment that doesn't demand it. And the second is to showcase Rhaenys' moral fiber.
Her moral standpoint become the reason for inaction rather than action.
We wanted a triumphal moment for her at the end of the season, but I think probably doesn't want to be responsible for doing that to another mother. And it's a complex choice and one that people might dispute or have a problem with.
So we're supposed to believe that Rhaenys is a good person for sparing the life of a fellow mother while she tramples to death hundreds of innocent civilians with her dragon.
Great heroic moment for her character.
But don't worry, civilians don't count. An actual writer from this show said that.
Remember, we were in the writer's room one day, and I was like, it would be awesome if Rhaenys just came through the floor on a dragon.
And this becomes the launchpad for Rhaenys representing the moral pillar of Team Black. I know that moving forward people kind of like Rhaenys, but I don't really care about her after this. They kind of just want you to move on and overlook the whole mass murder thing, because the scene looked cool and it was a big spectacle. I know Rhaenys is meant to be a good guy and she supports Rhaenyra against the patriarchy, but you just massacred people. You're a murderer. You're a mass murderer. One of the appeals of moral ambiguity is that it keeps the viewer guessing. Inconsistent morals mean we don't always know how someone will react, which creates tension. And while their choices don't always need to be consistent, their character does. When moral choices sporadically veer from one end of the spectrum to the other, the character becomes inconsistent and unrealistic, not morally ambiguous. There's a fine line. Forceful moral vindication is no way to craft an authentic character, nor an empathetic one. There's a disconnect between what we feel and what we're being encouraged to feel. We recognize that the show is trying to make us root for certain people, but our experiences with those people don't line up with the character being presented. Circling back to Rhaenyra and Alicent, we need to talk about the secret meetups. Despite Blood and Cheese, I kind of thought season 2 was off to a strong start when it first aired, but there was an exact moment in the 3rd episode when I suddenly realized things were going downhill very, very quickly. So Rhaenyra suggested sneaking into the Red Keep, which is not in the books, so I assume it's like this multi-episode arc where Mysaria smuggles her into King's Landing and she gets a first-hand experience of what life is like for the small folk, which will make her reevaluate her perspective on the war and her place within it. It would certainly be a more compelling justification for her reluctance to go to war now that she's getting a chance to live among the people who will be most severely affected, as opposed to saving the world from ice zombies in 200 years. But then we hard cut to her in King's Landing dressed as a nun, stumbling on Alicent in the Great Sept by pure happenstance. This came off the back of 2 consecutive episodes of people sneaking into each other's castles, by the way. They have their little confrontation and there's some good dialogue and great acting, but nothing really comes from it. I spent the rest of the season recovering from this stupid plot point. And then they did it again.
Another one.
This time, Alicent's sorry for everything, and she agrees to give up her son's life to save the city from needless bloodshed. No, I'm sorry, this is just not what happens. It just isn't. 8 episodes in the season, and 4 of them involve someone sneaking into a heavily fortified castle. I don't think other people were as put off by it as I was, but this, for me, was just so immersion breaking. So as someone who understands the rules of this world, you can't just keep fast traveling somewhere and sneaking into big castles. This has been happening in Game of Thrones since season 4. We criticized it then, and we can criticize it now. Throw whatever excuse at me you like, conflicting historical accounts, unreliable narrators, whatever. It simply does not happen. Alicent had a role to play in this war. She was a bad person at times, and she made bad decisions. She's human, and this season just robs both of these women of their complexity and accountability.
Who's next?
Shall we say his name?
Daemon's character has been another point of frustration for many viewers. Daemon is George's favourite Targaryen and one of his all-time favourite characters.
I think he has to rank up there as my favorite.
His introduction to Daemon communicates this very clearly. Over the centuries, House Targaryen has produced both great men and monsters. Prince Daemon was both. In his day, there was not a man so admired, so beloved, and so reviled in all of Westeros. He was made of light and darkness in equal parts. To some, he was a hero, to others, the blackest of villains. Now, George loves his morally grey characters the most, so when he writes a paragraph that's essentially a testament to the sheer ambiguity of their morals, it's his way of saying, this is one of my favourites. Let's see how Sarah Hess describes him. He ain't Paul Rudd. Sorry, that's taken out of context. The full quote is, he's become the internet boyfriend in a way that baffles me. Daemon himself is, I don't want him to be my boyfriend. I'm a little baffled how they're all, oh daddy, and I'm just like, really? How? In what way was he a good partner, father, brother, to anybody? You got me. He ain't Paul Rudd. And just look at the question this quote is answering. If Viserys was about to rule against Rhaenyra, Daemon would have let his brother fall flat on his face. In other words, are all of Daemon's moments, even the seemingly benevolent ones, ultimately self-serving? Hess agreed with this statement, so I'd like to remind you that there is a scene in Season 1 where Daemon is unsure as to whether Viserys is going to affirm his support for Rhaenyra's claim. And in that scene, he quite literally stops his brother from falling flat on his face. And Sarah Hess is agreeing with this statement. I know she's not read the books, but she must have at least seen the original show. I didn't watch Game of Thrones. I haven't seen it. I think that was actually a plus. I'm familiar with the world and all that stuff, but I didn't necessarily feel a whole bunch of loyalty to, like, the story because I haven't seen it. Daemon still manages to be an enticing character, in no small part thanks to Matt Smith's inherent charisma. But for a man made of light and darkness in equal parts, there's a lot more dark than light. His escapades as a hooded assassin are completely fabricated for the show. So this ridiculous scene where he murders Rhea Royce in a random valley where she's completely alone is just... it's just there. And to be clear, it's not that he murdered Rhea in the books and the history's never accounted for it, it literally didn't happen. In episodes where he should shine as a heroic swordsman, he prevails looking like a serial killer. He grooms Rhaenyra, he grooms Laena, he abandons Rhaenyra while she miscarries, he mutilates civilians, he mocks his brother's dead infant. We know that he had multiple scenes cut from season 1, including one where he consoles his daughters after Laena's death. There's another where he has an exchange with Viserys, who considers telling him about Aegon's prophecy before abstaining, and another where he gives a toast to Viserys during episode 8. So any attempt to add complexity or light to this character has been completely thrown out. Season 1 does a much better job with his nuances than Season 2, though that's not saying much, mainly because of his complex relationship with Viserys. Ultimately, he does love his brother, and under all the hatred and jealousy, there's a devotion he can never quite shake, and it does give him some redeeming value, similar to Cersei with her children. But much like Rhaenyra and Alicent, in Season 2, his character development suffers from the addition of Aegon's prophecy. In the book, most of his redemption comes through his relationship with a character called Nettles. She is incredibly important to the story, but when we finally do get to meet her in the show...
I was wondering what you guys thought about Rhaena and Sheepstealer and how they've kind of merged her character, it seems, with Nettles from the book.
In the book, the character Nettles plays a really important role.
I've
and
heard
it's
a
really
lot
kind of
about
a fan
Nettles.
favorite. It looks like perhaps Rhaena
has
is
been cut out.
going to be the writer for Sheepstealer.
Hot D uses prophecy and weirwood dreams as a vehicle for Daemon's growth. They replace a human catalyst for his development with an LSD-induced ego death that makes him pledge fealty to Rhaenyra.
I mean, he's a White Walker, which is cool. I was like, come on, that's cool.
I guess we have to talk about Nettles a little bit here. We're not going to go too deep into that territory because it seems like a lot of her character stuff is being tacked onto Rhaena instead, but essentially Nettles is a mysterious character who tags along with the Dragon Seeds and claims Sheepstealer. She eventually develops a relationship with Daemon, initially thought to be of a paternal nature, but later speculated to involve some kind of intimacy, and in the show it could easily be changed. Her mere existence is a challenge to Daemon's character, a man who relishes in his genetic superiority and Valyrian ancestry, who's now clashing with a lowborn girl with no apparent blood connection and zero Valyrian genetic traits. This conflict was instead given to Jace in lieu of his arc at Winterfell, and his insecurity of his bastard heritage makes him angry, so he takes it out on the small folk who ride dragons, but it just makes him come off as an arrogant, spoiled snob. Nettles' ancestry remains a mystery, and that's what undermines Targaryen supremacy, because if someone with supposedly no Targaryen lineage can ride a dragon, maybe anyone can, and the Targaryens aren't special. The Dragon Seeds maybe could have conveyed this theme in the show, but the writers specifically added in all their backstory, making each of them explain their heritage and how it ties back to a Targaryen, completely destroying the intended effect. Through Nettles, Daemon develops a genuine human connection that helps him reevaluate his perspective and rediscover his humanity. After lamenting on so many failed relationships in Season 2, it would make sense that he redeems himself through another human relationship. Cutting her from this show is like cutting Brienne from Jaime's storyline. The writers have neglected two key narrative devices Martin uses when crafting a good character arc. The first is human connection. In most great fiction, corruption and redemption both stem from human relationships. To bring back the Star Wars comparison, Darth Vader is corrupted through the breakdown of trust in his relationship with his wife and mentors, then redeemed through his relationship with his son, similar to Jaime with Brienne and Cersei. As Jaime starts to value honor more, he grows distant from Cersei and closer with Brienne, because she aligns more with his changing moral values. The second device is stripping a character down to their defining attributes. So this is when a character is stripped down to their very core, throwing out all their abilities and resources to highlight how their true strength lies in their ingenuity and willpower. This rather simple technique created a pop culture icon out of a talking pickle. And we see this again in Jaime's storyline. Losing his sword hand prompts him to reevaluate his purpose, and it forces him to use his mind and his wits to overcome challenges. In the books, we also see this again with Tyrion. After losing his wealth and fortune and fleeing to the east, he has to learn to survive on his own as a dwarf stuck in Essos, using his wit. Looking back to Daemon, his relationship with Nettles offers him a chance to nurture an innocent, daring woman after spending a lifetime corrupting them. His relationship with Nettles serves as the redemption through human connection. Nettles also provides the opportunity to strip him of his defining attributes and see what lies underneath, because Daemon's entire identity is shaped around his obsession with ancestral power and genetic supremacy. So to see someone with none of his traits or genetic heritage have the same abilities as him forces him to shift his perspective, and that obsession with power and ancestry then transitions into love for an individual based on their unique beauty as a person. And in the books, his relationship with Nettles makes him grow distant from Rhaenyra, but in the show he's just restated his devotion to her and swore to never leave again. Now you might say, well, if they did do the seductive relationship angle, that would still be very creepy, and it would undermine everything you're saying. But they could just cut that. God knows they've cut everything else. It would be an easy change, and it's not even confirmed in the books, so it wouldn't even be diverging from the material. But you might still be asking why this stuff can't just be tacked onto Rhaena. Well, first of all, Rhaena is a Targaryen, so there's no uncertainty over her genetic heritage. Daemon is no longer redeemed through a human connection, and Rhaena loses the one trait that distinguishes her from everyone else in the story. You see, Rhaena is in a unique position as a dragonless Targaryen in a time where dragons are most needed. It's the setup for a great character arc, again, stripping her down to her defining attributes. She would have to learn to use what tools are available to her to compensate for her lack of a dragon. Her siblings don't have to concern themselves as much with scheme, wit, diplomacy, or education to be an effective asset. And staying true to the books wouldn't have obstructed her character arc either, because in Fire and Blood she does get a dragon, but it's a hatchling, still too young to fight. But instead we get the worst of both worlds. Just Daemon tripping balls for 5 episodes, Rhaena running around a field, Jace scolding the working class, and Nettles completely cut from the story. We can see now how simplifying one character bleeds into the simplification of others, and George's post about the butterflies feels all the more valid. Overall, it's difficult to see Daemon as anything other than a separate villain with a mutual enemy, at least for the first 2 seasons. Any redeeming value is carried by style, charisma, and humor, and in Hot D, there is a crucial misunderstanding between morally grey characters who are neither hero nor villain, and villains we can empathize with. It's the difference between Jaime and Cersei. Jaime has committed both heroic and villainous acts in equal measure. Cersei solely commits villainous acts, but we understand why she does. Understanding a villain's origin and psyche and how they came to be what they are now is what makes a good villain, not a morally ambiguous character. Marvel movies are capable of pulling this off in a couple of scenes, but Hot D expects us to view people as morally grey just because we've witnessed moments of sadness and insecurity on occasion. These moments are not enough for us to resonate with them moving forward if they're going to exclusively commit villainous actions. We've seen that in Daemon, but let's also look at Aegon and Aemond, a masochist's response to the Chuckle brothers. Aegon is the strangest to me. The nature of his coronation is so blatantly evil that you'd expect them to balance it out by making him, at the very least, not detestable. What's stranger is the way in which it's relayed to us that he's a bad person. Every vile thing we learn about him is told to us and never shown. Now in the books there isn't much evidence to suggest he's like this. He's definitely a bit of a horn dog, and he's not necessarily the most competent ruler. It's not entirely clear. There is one instance where he wins an auction to sleep with a girl. That's not ideal. But they take things to a whole new level in the show by making him an abuser of women. Now I have to be careful with my language because of YouTube censorship, but we all know the word I'm thinking of and it should not be taken lightly. And on top of that, he's a fan of child fighting rings where they fight to the death. Those are two of the worst things a human can be, and there's nothing you can do at that point to balance him out with redeeming values. It took castration for us to empathize with Theon Greyjoy, and he never did anything nearly so evil. So I don't think a medium rare Aegon is enough to redeem him now, and even if they did, I wouldn't feel great about that. Similar to Alicent, it's not just the added villainy, it's the neglect of a logical point for a redeeming value. Now the logical point could be Sunfire, his dragon. Sunfire is famous for his exceptional beauty in the book, so much so that it's a narrative and political device. A splendid creature with gleaming golden scales and pale pink wing membranes. Sunfire was the name given to this dragon of the Golden Dawn. Now in the show, his design is nice and I do quite like it, but it's a little lackluster in comparison, but more importantly, it's never the point of focus. Like it's never really acknowledged. And that's even more annoying when you consider how much money the show burns on needless dragon stuff. I mean, in some ways, Luke's dragon is more accurate to Sunfire than the actual Sunfire, so it's not like they're incapable of doing it properly. But the reason I'm bringing all this up is because the contrast between Aegon's beautiful dragon and his ugly nature is a good narrative contrast and a chance to provide him a human connection. I know it's a dragon, but just hear me out. Perhaps Aegon is a monster, but he bears all the superficial Targaryen traits that validate his claim. Much like Sunfire, who has a beautiful coat of golden scales that hide the monster within. All the best parts of Aegon are in this dragon, a dragon loved by the small folk, and his design is used as a component of propaganda to claim that Aegon was chosen to be king by the gods who bestowed upon him the most beautiful dragon ever seen. For all his faults, the guy has a special relationship with this monster that he could never get from his family, and seeing that relationship would help us feel empathy towards him, but we barely ever see Sunfire before he flies out to Rook's Rest, at which point he gets killed, so the one redeeming quality Aegon has to his name was completely cut. Now, Sunfire doesn't die in the books, and his relationship with Aegon grows even stronger, and it becomes quite heartbreaking. Now, potential spoilers for Season 3 here, but it's probably out by the time you're watching this. I think the show is very clearly setting up a reveal that Sunfire is still alive, so we might get to see the rest of this relationship. But again, it's a little too late, and because his character is so evil, I felt nothing when Aegon and his dragon fell from the sky at Rook's Rest, because he's a monster and he deserves to die like one. And can you please stop mewing? Speaking of mewing, we have to talk about Aemond. We have enough of a picture of Aemond's childhood to understand how he became the way he is, but by Season 2, Episode 5, he's a weird, evil elf prince with a pet monster. He's crippled his brother beyond repair and now tortures him. He's also harassing his traumatized autistic sister and ordering his mother to get back in the kitchen, and then he's kissing her. He's kissing his mum on the lips. What the fuck was this? There's just nothing to resonate with here. He's like a villain out of Lord of the Rings or Hellboy. Just from listening to the interviews with the writers, it's obvious that they've never nailed down who Aemond is in their own mind.
He's driven by a very cold rationality.
Aemond is going to be an interesting loose cannon in Season 3.
We've always talked about Aemond as being the ultimate pragmatist.
He lashes out.
Aemond lashes out. It's also a strategic act.
This is not how somebody who feels really sure about what they're doing behaves.
Aemond sees the world in a very black and white way.
I believe in gray characters. I don't believe in black and white characters.
He's cold and rational, but he's also impulsive and lashes out. He's scared, but he's also not scared. And he's insecure, but he's also really cool. In the books, this guy is threatening. In the show, he's not. He's just a pathetic little incel. Now, I don't have a problem with them making him an incel with a bunch of insecurities. That's part of what makes a good character. But there's nothing really to balance it out. There's no redeeming quality to someone like Aemond. It just makes him intensely cringe. The obvious moment to make us empathize with Aemond is when he loses his eye. He was still a dick in that scene in the book, but the Velaryon girls weren't there, so the show paints it more like Luke and Jace are these heroic protectors. And Aemond now comes off as this murderous psychopath who deserved to lose the eye. So there isn't any real moment to feel sorry for him during this scene at all. Now we have two brothers, both lacking in redeeming qualities and meaningful relationships. The solution here feels like a no-brainer. Develop a more complex relationship between the two of them. The show has gone to great lengths to create a mirror between these two brothers and their predecessors, Viserys and Daemon. One of the reasons they gave Viserys leprosy in the show was so that they could eventually draw the comparison with Aegon. And the show also brings Aemon's comparison with Daemon way into the forefront, to the point where it's a bit too on the nose. So a lot of effort has gone into making them a mirror for these two, but they end up becoming a dark mirror. As I've mentioned before, one of Daemon's few redeeming qualities in the show was his relationship with Viserys. It was deeply complicated, sometimes hateful, but often moving, and it was always heartwarming to see them reconcile, especially towards the end. By contrast, Aegon and Aemon's relationship is one of pure hatred. Aegon viciously bullies his brother as a child, and Aemon in turn tries to kill him and torture him and take the throne. Now in season 3, we're seeing lines like this.
I'm going to kill my brother, or die in the attempt.
Adding more nuance to their brotherly bond would have made their storylines much more tragic and human, while also adding depth and maybe even giving us something to root for. What if Larys was smuggling Aegon out of King's Landing at Aemon's request, while Aemon is fighting to protect his brother's throne? He's the only one who understands his brother's childhood, and they could put aside their differences and grow stronger as they get older. This would make them both more empathetic. You would actually have something. Aemon would actually feel like he has something to lose other than his big dragon and his shiny throne. Alright, we're nearly there, but there's one more character we need to talk about. Of all the butchered character arcs, Criston Cole might be the most severe, but Fabian Frankel is doing some Atlas level of carrying with his character, and I just cannot help but find him compelling. His monologue in season 2 is easily the best part of that season for me. I don't really take issue with the nature of his character, it's more to do with how we got there. His arc throughout the show so far best displays how the misunderstanding of multiple core components can work in tandem and snowball into an inherent failure to do justice to the source material. Cole's trajectory from naive honorable knight to raging incel suffering an existential crisis became a violent, jarring mess, which raised eyebrows even when the show debuted. This all begins with Rhaenyra's rejection, which was handled so poorly. He demands that they abandon their life and the throne and run away to the middle of nowhere. Rhaenyra obviously can't do that, but offers an amazing alternative. Criston would be the personal bodyguard to the woman he loves, who is the queen, and married to a gay man with a mutual understanding to continue their love lives behind closed doors. This is the best possible life a man like Criston could ever have dreamt of, literally having his cake and eating it too. Not only would he very likely become Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the most prestigious position a warrior can aspire to, but he'd also not suffer the setbacks of having to remain chaste, being able to live with his lover and never suffer any consequence. Yes, it's understandable that an authentic character could still take issue with having to hide their love life forever, but that conflict should be gradual, not a split-second switch-up. This scene then leads into a vicious murder followed by attempted suicide. This whole episode is such a mess that I've carved out an entire section of the video to go over it, because the neglected alternative from the book fixes everything. So let's just say for now that in Fire and Blood, it was handled much better. The outburst emerges again in episode 9 with the god-awful Beesbury table smashing, which is a meltdown perhaps a little less jarring if episode 4 had been handled better. But for now, that's all we'll say on characters. Nevertheless, we'll see how the simplification of these people will bleed into every other problem that we're going to discuss.
Steak! Where's my steak?
Stakes are the most vital part of the Game of Thrones formula, and the latter won't work without the former. From Ned Stark's death, we learn that no one is safe, but until Season 1, Episode 9, we'd never had quite such a visceral reaction to any character that had died before. Character authenticity, by definition, will create high stakes, but simplifying characters makes it harder to maintain them. We're not forming the same connections, but what lowers the stakes even more is the lack of consequences following on from the death of a character. Viserys' death had left an impact because we built a connection with a complex person, but also because his death gave way to every event that ensued. Similar to Ned or Robb Stark, the effect of their demise ripples throughout the world on a micro and macro scale. On the macro scale, things manifest in ways that benefit the story. Oberyn's death leads to the introduction of a whole new section of characters, even if that show didn't do a great job with that section. But take an instance like the Red Wedding. In the aftermath, we see Arya and the Hound traveling across the desolation of war, fields strewn with slain Stark bannermen, and the Lannisters gaining more territory wherever you look. The event was so horrible that a character as deplorable as the Hound becomes the rock in her story. A ceremonial sword is melted down and reforged for the enemy. Winterfell is occupied by reviled traitors, and that occupation plays into Stannis' decision to travel north, drastically affecting the course of events that take place at the Wall and bringing together characters from different worlds. Political structures change and the balance of power tips in one direction. But exploring the consequences on the micro scale is even more important, because that loops back around into character authenticity. We watch each of the Starks process their grief in different ways, and at different times, because word cannot reach them all at once. That delay in Jon hearing of Robb's death keeps the memory of him and the event lingering. Even when someone as evil as Tywin dies, it means that other characters that we're following are exposed to more danger, like Jaime. And those we've lost can live on in others. Brienne begins her new mission to honor Catelyn after her death, whereas Robb starts to resemble Ned after his execution. And after Robb's death, Jon starts to resemble Ned and becomes King in the North, carrying on Robb's legacy. But in House of the Dragon, aside from Viserys, we can never really match that level of consequence. A failure to commit to a single identity led to very little world building, so even if character deaths do have a knock-on effect, the world being affected by them isn't in focus. But more importantly, characters recover from grief way too quickly, and there's no lingering impact. Instead, each character gets a moment or a scene where they do something that helps them process the guilt, and then we just go back to normal. Luke's death was the climactic twist of Season 1, but in retrospect, it had very little impact. Constant recasting due to poor pacing meant we haven't had enough screen time with the actor, so we never really developed a solid connection to him. It's the same reason a villain as hated as Joffrey has a more memorable and impactful death than his far more empathetic siblings. He's been more relevant to the story, and we've been following the same actor throughout, unlike his siblings. But what's more important than casting is that Rhaenyra recovers from Luke's death too quickly. The final shot of Season 1 reveals her raw, powerful reaction to the event, which is continued in a single scene in Season 2's opening episode. She finds some of Luke's remains, and that's it. Her and Jace then have one scene together where they process the loss, but by episode 2, she never mentions Luke's name again. She's more concerned with the PR and the fallout from Blood and Cheese, and Aemon barely acknowledges the event at all. I found a great article where Ewan Mitchell discusses what's going through Aemon's mind after Blood and Cheese. He talks about processing the guilt of what happened to Luke, and how he partly feels responsible for Jaehaerys' death. And that's great, but it's not conveyed on screen whatsoever. Actors have to fill in the gaps for the sake of their performance, and they're doing a great job, but none of the writers are conveying it on screen. After Blood and Cheese, Alicent is more or less apathetic. Aegon is angry, but then again, he gets to process his grief in a single event by killing Blood. Corlys does grieve for Rhaenys a little longer, but once again, he gets an allotted scene where he resolves it by giving his ship a ridiculously long name. In the book, word of Luke's death reaches Winterfell last, so Jace's grief is delayed. He then has to process this loss while surrounded by the Starks, and form connections with them. Delaying Jace's grief thereby allows the impact of Luke's death to linger a little longer, but we've cut that subplot and replaced it with a nostalgia-baiting wall scene with lots of mogging and mewing. Stop mewing. So there's so many elements at play here. We have poor pacing, a poor use of budget, a lack of identity, and a lack of stakes. And all of these are bleeding into one another. Stop mewing, stop fucking mewing. You might think the Red Wedding and Luke's death are not really comparable. Fine. We'll do another comparison between Luke and Micah the Butcher's Boy.
Who?
For those who don't remember, Micah was Arya's friend who got into a bit of a tussle with Joffrey in the second episode of the show. He had a handful of lines and hardly any screen time, the most minor of minor characters. He was killed off screen by the Hound, but Arya never forgave, and more importantly, she never forgot. In Season 3, when the Hound is put on trial by the Brotherhood Without Banners, his charge is for the murder of Micah, after they can't pin him down on anything else. Then, in the last episode of Season 4, the Hound brings him up again when trying to convince Arya to kill him, and his name is mentioned several times in between these instances. Lucerys Velaryon dies in Episode 10. After Season 2, Episode 2, Luke's name appears again in 2 scenes, sparingly. He has been acknowledged in 1 or 2 scenes in Season 3 so far, but he was so much more of a main character than Micah ever was, and he still hasn't had as many mentions. But in the grand scheme of things, the death of Micah the Stable Boy has had a longer lasting impact on characters than Lucerys Velaryon. That's all we're going to say on stakes right now, but you're going to see it pop up again and again as we address other elements of the show. Many characters dabble in schemes and intrigue. It's how you play the titular Game of Thrones. There's very little point in building such a rich world unless you get to watch our characters navigate within it. And when it came to scheming in Game of Thrones, there were 2 primary forces of intrigue, stemming from Littlefinger and Varys. Now, we briefly mentioned that Laris and Mysaria have quite clearly filled the shoes in Hot D, as they did in Fire and Blood. But the nature of scheming in the show is painfully surface level, and it lacks all the subtlety that makes Intrigue so compelling in the first place.
You might wear one of your mother's dresses.
House of the Dragon is not fundamentally incapable of executing subtle, compelling intrigue. I particularly enjoyed Lionel Strong's exchange with Viserys in episode 3, and I also love this little moment in the season finale, a nod to the Grand Maester conspiracy and the agendas of a Lord's retinue. However, aside from the earlier episodes of season 1, intrigue in Hot D is almost always on the nose and lacks the tactfulness that separates scheming from gossip. It often feels more like watching the Real Housewives of Westeros instead of palace intrigue.
Betrayed me. There are choices to be made.
Does she know?
I acknowledge the struggle. Your son Viserys was a bastard.
Mysaria is one of these people who's a historical figure in the book and not really a character.
You know, I actually wrote this section before I listened to this Condor podcast, and the 3 points I came up with were: 1. Maintaining ambiguous motivations.
We actually don't know really what her ultimate plots and motivations were and what was moving her. So we've tried to brush a lot of detail and texture into her character, her philosophy, her political alignment.
Weaving schemers in and out of the overarching story.
She's very shadowy. She kind of weaves her way in and out of the story. She comes in and disappears, which is rich dramatic ground to write on, and to craft a character and hopefully tell this multi-season arc of a character that goes through a really big change.
Making schemers have a more effective presence off-screen than on-screen.
Again, where you take the dotted line outline and you start connecting the dots and coloring in within the lines. But how do we get there, and what leads to those events happening?
I swear I had not even listened to this yet, but I could not believe that Condor was contradicting all of my points in one sentence. He acknowledges that she weaves in and out of the story in the book, and his response to that was to destroy the sense of weaving in and out. We don't know what her ultimate motivations are, and we're not supposed to. That's what makes her interesting, but they saw that as a prompt to fill those gaps and remove all the interesting parts. So one of the most important elements of intrigue is tell, don't show. Now, the rule in storytelling is show, don't tell. I know I did a big thing on it earlier, but intrigue is one of the few instances where the opposite is true. Littlefinger and Varys rarely have any direct involvement in a plan unless desperate or arriving at that plan's fruition. Hot D shows Mysaria and Laris overtly scheming, and it undermines their ability to accumulate power and build networks that allow them to operate behind the scenes without getting their hands dirty. Showing each step of the plan deteriorates its impact. We should be left wondering what background characters are agents of someone else, and see rumors spreading around King's Landing passively without the intervention of another agent. And, most of all, we should only discover someone's involvement in a plan long after its execution. The schemer is deceiving us, the audience, just as much as they're deceiving the characters in the show. It creates a tension that lingers in the story. We are most safe with these people when they're right in front of us, and their presence should feel heavier when they're off-screen as opposed to when they're on it. Instead, we have every plan spelled out for us constantly. Condor's always going on about budget and screen time, but how does it benefit the story to watch Rhaenyra's handmaid travel to King's Landing, get past the city watch, walk through the streets, and then into a nondescript room to spread rumors? What do we gain from seeing the same 2 or 3 characters carrying out the dirty work? We burn money, we waste screen time, and it certainly doesn't convey a sense of a vast network of spies as much as it conveys a network of the same 3 people. Mysaria's schemes are always explicitly shown, even in season 1 where there's the scene of Alicent's handmaiden reporting Viserys' death to Mysaria. If that scene had been cut, we would have been left wondering how Mysaria knows what she knows. She must have agents in the Red Keep, and she would feel more intimidating. But instead we watch Alicent's handmaiden spoon feed her all the information. This is Sapochnik's wife, by the way. Maybe they just wanted to squeeze in a little more screen time for her, I don't know. Daemon loves sneaking around in his little cloak, spawning on a random hill to murder his wife, or hiring Blood and Cheese directly, or planning Laenor's death and sneaking into a heavily fortified castle, which is something I guess everyone's doing now all the time. As mentioned before, Daemon has no hand in Rhae's death in the book, but even if you wanted to make that change, not showing the act would have been more powerful. We'd never truly know for certain if he did it or not, much like his Heir for a Day speech in the pilot. That adds more danger and tension to his character. His morality is being left to the audience's imagination. But no, more budget, more screen time, more painting him as a villain, more mewing. Stop mewing. Laris might be the least subtle person who ever stepped foot in King's Landing. We watch him recruit agents to murder Lionel and Harwin Strong, and he gives them a special little brooch. That way, 10 minutes later, we don't forget who devised the little scheme. We've got a nice special little label that says, "This is a Laris scheme." Compare this to The Purple Wedding, where the plot plays out from the perspective of someone who isn't remotely involved, Sansa. In Sansa's point of view, they introduce Sir Dontos. He gives her a necklace, they form a plan to escape, and it feels like its own plot. But all of the planning for Joffrey's murder is taking place in these scenes, without the culprits ever making an appearance until long after the fact. Joffrey's murder literally happens right under our nose, and we never even see it. And the show gives us huge hints for stuff like this, but it's still subtle enough that you don't clock it, and they pepper small clues throughout the story. Like when the Hound says,
"Poison's a woman's weapon. Men kill with steel."
That's your stupid pride talking.
and that's a great balance of subtlety, because he might be onto something, but he also could just be a bit of a sexist. We never would have guessed that Olenna was involved, and when it's later revealed, it makes us realize that everything we've seen of her so far is just a surface level understanding of her character, making her all the more intimidating. That is subtlety. That is deceiving your audience. That is good scheming. And there's no clips of her lurking in the shadows behind a pillar, unlike both of our main schemers in Hot D. Tell, don't show.
She's very shadowy. She kind of weaves her way in and out of the story. She comes in and disappears, which is rich dramatic ground to write on, and to craft a character.
All right, so point 2, weave in and out of the story. When Larys is on screen, it's just painfully obvious what is happening. He stands in the corner like a little NPC, waiting for Alicent or Aegon to initiate a cutscene. They'd be better off holding up a sign that says, "This is the intrigue section of the show." And when Otto visits Mazaria in episode 9, again, it feels like we're entering the intrigue section. It undermines the nature of intrigue when you carve out a section specifically for it, instead of weaving it into the larger narrative, because the real-world writing structure then mirrors the in-world character's scheming. Intrigue needs to be woven into the larger narrative, integrated into scenes that begin and end with other aims. Scenes that move the story forward in one way, while the spy master moves it forward in another, without you ever even knowing. Most of the scenes that focus on Littlefinger in Season 4 are also showing Sansa's character development. Littlefinger doesn't sit in the corner waiting for you to pass by and then ask for a private conversation, at least in the early seasons. When Catelyn reunites with him in Season 1 to discuss the attempt on Bran's life and get a gauge on the state of affairs in King's Landing, she asks him about the owner of the Cat's Paw dagger. He instinctively runs the numbers in his head to figure out what answer would most benefit his plans and arrives at Tyrion just on the spot. We don't even know what he's doing until much later, and there's an undeniable difference in the way that both of these shows handle this aspect.
We actually don't know really what her ultimate plots and motivations were and what was moving her. So we've tried to brush a lot of detail and texture into her character, her philosophy, her political alignment.
Point 3. We should never know the true motives or allegiances of these schemers. That mystery makes them dangerous and unpredictable. How can you ever fully understand your foe if you don't know what they want? Nevertheless, Mazaria states her allegiance out loud all the time to Rhaenyra, explaining how and why she's aligned with her. While Larys suddenly finds a heart and takes pity on Aegon, who now also has a severe physical impairment. They both become narrative tools instead of characters. Whenever Team Green or Black need something done discreetly, they push their respective intrigue buttons and the appropriate scheme emerges. It took a lot of time to figure out what Littlefinger and Varys' goals actually were. In reality, they're actually pretty simple, but the journey we took to get there was a thrill. Littlefinger would help Ned, then betray him, then save Sansa and lie to Cersei, then kill Lysa. You never really know his next move, and Varys tended to help the good guys more than the bad, yes, but it took a long time to figure out his true goal was linked to Daenerys, and he's more unpredictable in the books. The performances alone in Hot D remove any air of mystery. Again, it's not the actors themselves. I've seen both of these actors in other things and they're very talented. It's the direction and the dialogue. I think I've made my point, but I think one more comparison that really sums up the differences is the respective carnal desires of Littlefinger and Larys. Littlefinger suffered a tragic humiliation as a boy when fighting for Catelyn's hand in marriage. He was a scrawny boy defeated by a fierce, tall Stark. He learned he would never be able to get what he wanted through physical prowess, so he turned to other means for power. He rises through the ranks, gets Catelyn's husband killed, who is a Stark, and then plans to seduce her daughter, a younger, prettier version of his first love. Creepy, twisted, evil, but compelling. Larys has a clubfoot, so he has a foot fetish. I think that pretty much sums it up. Alright, up next, a key aspect of any story that elevates character engagement is the world in which they operate. The more immersed we become in the world, the more authentic the characters feel. The more intimate the connection we develop with them, the higher the stakes become. A Song of Ice and Fire has always been a shining example of world building in every aspect. Westeros is rich with history and lore. I've discussed how Hot D's story can never truly flesh out the world in the same way as its predecessor, and because of that it becomes harder to immerse us in the world, but not impossible. You don't have to expand on the histories of every distant land or noble house to make this world feel alive, but you do need to expand on the socio-economic status, the geopolitical tensions, and the cultural norms and customs wherever possible. House of the Dragon is mostly confined to a handful of locales, specifically large castles filled with nobles, but that shouldn't be a limiting factor. Seven Kingdoms is mostly set at one tourney, but the world still feels alive. So if our story is mainly set between King's Landing, Driftmark, and Dragonstone, we need to see more than a few big empty rooms with some interesting tapestries on the wall.
The true history of the world is a history of great conversations in elegant rooms.
Who said this?
Me.
Hot D's production crew is obviously immensely talented, from the set design and costume design to prop departments and everything else. And the behind the scenes content shows just how much work and thought and love goes into even the most minute of details in any given scene. So when I criticize immersion from a production perspective, it's aimed at the higher levels of production, those making the big decisions at the top, the showrunners and writers. They're the ones telling the production designers how to make the sets and what to make. So when I am critiquing this stuff, I'm not critiquing them. While every set and location looks epic in scope and very well designed, there is a certain emptiness to it, which adds an uncanny element. Early Game of Thrones was severely limited in terms of budget and VFX, but they managed to pull it off in no small part due to practical effects and real locations. Hot D doesn't suffer the same budgetary setbacks, and neither does Seven Kingdoms, so I'd like to compare a couple of scenes from the shows. Hot D Season 1 tries to explore King's Landing wherever it can, and this is important because it's one of the few times we get to explore the world outside of a big empty castle. So in Season 1, Daemon and Rhaenyra sneak out for the night, passing through the streets where each person has their own little trick or gimmick in a sort of Cirque du Freak. We go by a local play and move on to a brothel, and it's fine, but it feels more like ticking off a checklist. The montage feels like an advert for the King's Landing experience instead of a genuine experience. Season 2 tries to further integrate the small folk perspective through the dragon seeds, Hugh, Ulf, Adam, and Alan, but Hugh's scenes are mostly confined to one room, whereas Ulf is mostly confined to a local tavern with very few discernible features. Adam mostly loiters around a beach picking up seashells, and Alan is restricted to one port for the entire season. I've noticed that Game of Thrones and Succession have this very unique ability to introduce characters in the background and gradually make them more main without actually giving them an introduction. It's very fluid and natural, and it helps the world feel much more lived in, because this is how we get to know a lot of people in the real world, especially in institutions like school and the workplace. But House of the Dragon always makes it abundantly clear that someone is important from the get-go, and we should be focusing on them. The most recent example being this very pointless scene with Ormond Hightower, a scene that's interrupting the momentum of the Battle of the Gullet to do what? Have a character stand there and be a germaphobe. It's painfully obvious that we're focusing on these people and that they mean something to the story. So by the time of an event like the Red Sowing, it's very obvious that none of them are going to die because we've been following them and they're the only ones present who are relevant to the story. Then you have the worldview of the small folk, which the writers often spell out constantly, instead of just letting us sit with them and absorb everything from their perspective. Like when Kristen is parading the head of Melis through King's Landing, the small folk are discovering that dragons aren't immortal, they can be slain. But of course, Hugh has to explain this for us.
It's just me.
And by the way, if that wasn't clear enough from what he said, the inside the episode will explain all of that to you again.
Is seen as one of these symbols of the unshakableness, of the invincibility of the Targaryens.
You know, as soon as people can see you can kill dragons, well then anybody can do it.
We're not in the intrigue section anymore. This is not tell, don't show. It's show, don't tell. This is our chance to make Hot D's wider world feel alive, in a series where the bulk of the screen time is just nobles sitting in big empty rooms arguing. The Dragon Seat perspective needs to compensate for an absence of a living world in the rest of the show, especially if we're cutting out characters like Nettles. You might not look at this shot from King's Landing and see anything noticeably bad, but when you look at a King's Landing scene from Seven Kingdoms, it's night and day. The colour scheme in House of the Dragon is truly sad to see. Game of Thrones had been sapping the colour and life from the screen since around season 5, and when you look at some of the scenes from the earlier seasons compared to this, it's just like I just don't understand what happened. How could any professional look at these two images and think that the second one is better? I mean, yes, this started in Game of Thrones, but why continue it? I mean, look at A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. They did a handful of scenes in King's Landing, and it was amazing. The streets are cramped, claustrophobic, vile-looking places. Dunk and Rafe scavenge battlefields for broken armor and trade it for coin to buy passage to the east. We see brothels and street vendors, and we only get small peeks into each one through the tight framing of each shot, helping convey this sense of being cramped, trying to move around in an overcrowded city, as if the location itself is so small that even the camera has to wedge itself into little crawl spaces to observe the characters, and even then, they're only partly visible. The difference I'm talking about here is like the difference between throwing a few herbs in a boiling pot and cooking breakfast from scratch. That's what this is about: eggs and bread and ham. Dunk is selling a horse and budgeting for his food and armor, nabbing free meals wherever he can, and all these tiny little details add up to an authentic world that engulfs you, instead of a set where you can appreciate the design. With House of the Dragon, world building means lots of big things. Big sweeping vistas and VFX castles and caves and big dragons. But A Song of Ice and Fire doesn't feel magical because it features literal magic and larger than life locations. It's because it captures the magic of the real world. Yes, it does explore a grounded, realistic reflection of our own reality filled with horror and death and trauma and the burdens of the human condition. But there's also the moments in between, like sitting around a campfire on a starry night, and the sense of wonder and fear as you set off on a journey to somewhere new, or the delicious meals and the laughter between friends over a beer. Gargantuan castles and mountains and dragons and ice zombies all quiver in the shadow of a warm hearth and good company. The Shire feels very magical in Lord of the Rings, but there's nothing overtly magical about it. It's just beautiful countryside, cozy houses, and a sense of community. Game of Thrones is a modern response to Tolkien, but people forget that Tolkien is also its biggest inspiration. And despite having been set at a small tourney long after the dragons had died out, stop mewing, Seven Kingdoms has a magical Tolkien-esque quality in its music and its color palette and its ambience that Hot D never quite captures. That's why two Chads mogging and mewing on the wall feels less mystical than two ordinary blokes eating breakfast under a tree.
It does not befit a prince to pout.
I'm not pouting.
What would you call it then?
One of the weirdest things about House of the Dragon isn't necessarily the excessive use of dragons on screen, but more so how often they're on screen and how little we still know about them. One of the main challenges in Daenerys' story arc in Game of Thrones is understanding her dragons and her relationship with them, but we literally know so little about the nature of connections between dragons and Targaryens from this show. We never see a character describe what it feels like to be connected to this beast. We see them pet them and groom them, and we see them giving them commands or trying to tame them, but that is the extent of it. Now, there are some nice little details in Hot D, but they're so few and far between that people obsess over them. Stuff like the table balls, right? They're not bad, they're cool, and the little details should add up over time, but they kind of just stop there and obsess over one thing over and over again. They have an obsession with tiny little things like Funko Pops or something. Like there's a statue or an action figure for every kind of weird trivial process. Sometimes it's a crab claw, sometimes it's a house sigil. I mean, they've got action figures for picking the Kingsguard. Here they're just tossing coins onto a table. This is actually symbolism for them just pissing away the budget on needless shit. And then you've got the table balls. We don't see what people eat or do in a day. We don't see any shops or festivities or many local taverns. We just go back to the same set of rooms and balconies and cliffs. But it's okay because we've got these weird little fucking table balls that are basically just porn for people with OCD. Look at the table ball. When you're at a meeting, you have a ball. Your ball goes into the holder on the table. Always bring your table ball. You cannot attend the meeting without your table ball. Don't fiddle with the ball. This guy's fiddling with the ball. And this guy is also fiddling with the ball. And his son is also fiddling with the ball. So it's like symbolism because his granddad also fiddled with the table ball. So it's like a dynasty of kings that love fiddling with the table ball. And if you're feeling cheeky, you might move it around a bit or spin it. Dare I say we even start rolling the balls down the table. How about we smash a guy's fucking head into one? Fuck the table balls. This show is one big fucking table ball. Sorry. You know, I actually quite like them.
Relics of a dead regime.
I treated you harshly, and for that, I'm sorry.
To discuss the approach to world building more, we need to look at one of the biggest problems with Hot D as a whole, the use of budget. But before we talk about budget, we need to address the biggest budget burner. Everyone loves to preach about storylines and character development and pacing, but the minute any episode of Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon has a battle scene, the review scores skyrocket and it becomes the highest rated episode of the show ever. But if you can look past all the grey CGI mist and Rotten Tomatoes scores, you'll notice that there's something off about these battle scenes. Action is the big draw in any epic fantasy, but Game of Thrones knew how to pull off action like nobody else. Mainly because George R.R. Martin understood one crucial truth that most action movies still fail to understand today.
It's like violence is like sex. It's all about the build-up.
Action spectacle is the culmination of opposing forces gradually going down a path that leads to an inevitable crossroads. It demands a steady build-up, where we're continually investing in the characters to the point that we care about them, and fear for their safety as they gradually move towards danger. This is how we create stakes in a story. Game of Thrones felt different because it forces us to invest in characters on both ends of the battle. In Season 1, the Battle of the Green Fork landed Tyrion in the middle of a battle between the Lannisters and Starks. Naturally, we're rooting for the Starks, but Tyrion's presence complicates things. The battle has a great build-up where we learn more about Tyrion's past and connect with him on a deeper level than we ever have done before. The build-up is so good that by the time the battle arrives and they pull the cop out and skip the entire thing, we don't even really mind because we've gotten to the meat of the meal. At the core of any compelling action lies what we truly care about, the characters. During the battle for the Wall, we're rooting for Jon and the Night's Watch, but we also fear for Ygritte on the other side, and we know that Mance Rayder's cause is just. Stannis' victory during the Battle of the Blackwater would only be a good thing for us as the viewer. It would wipe out Joffrey, Cersei, Lancel, and the Hound, who are all some of the most despised characters in the story at this point, and it would be a huge benefit to Robb Stark's campaign. But once again, Tyrion is stuck in the middle, and we fear for his life as well as Sansa. And the episode also manages to make us empathize with Cersei, who shows how far she's willing to go to protect her child. It says a lot when someone as evil as Tywin Lannister can enter the room and have the audience be relieved. Stakes are an essential part of the build-up. Knowing that this event will have an impact on people we care about builds tension, and it's even more tense when we have characters on either side that we're rooting for. This works on the micro scale as well as the macro. Now, I have a lot of problems with the Hound versus Brienne, but for the sake of this argument, we've developed attachments to both people involved in this fight, and we don't want to lose either of them. Even with tertiary characters like Tormund and Alliser Thorne in the Battle for the Wall, we're placed in a difficult situation. Alliser fights for the Watch, and we want the Watch to win. He's also just made a truce with Jon Snow, whereas Tormund's humour and charm has won us over on the other side. So whether you like these men or not, they've both earned our respect, and the outcome of their clash can be worrying, and we'll have similar mixed emotions when Ygritte kills Pip. Action, deep down, is just another form of character expression. John Wick might seem a little bare bones in the character department, but it established stakes clearly and effectively. A sad, grieving man loses his cute dog, and that's it, we're invested. The following 60 minutes is an expression of his rage and grief, not just over his dog, but his lost love. It's an exercise in revenge, but also a very violent form of therapy, a way to process his loss, and find new meaning in his life now that his one purpose has been taken away. This idea of keeping the character at the focus of the action can go one step further. It's not just about making us invest in the characters up until the point of action, it's about continuing their story during the fight. Jon is a good example of this in the Battle of the Bastards. He's already been brought back to life by Melisandre, but he's had no desire to live. For the rest of the season, he's only done what's expected of him because he thinks he has to, he has a duty, but he doesn't actually have any desire to win. He just exists. And it's only during the moment where death becomes imminent, buried under a pile of trampled corpses, does he finally fight for his life. He makes a decision to survive. Another great example of this is Gren. In the space of one scene, we watch Gren go from a soldier who follows orders to a leader who rallies his men and summons the courage to face an unbeatable foe. An entire character arc is conveyed in this one scene. The Battle for the Wall also explores Jon stepping up into a leadership role, and it follows Sam as he finally overcomes his cowardice and starts running towards his problems instead of away from them. The other key aspect of build-up was making battles a standalone episode where we can sit with the characters trapped in the situation, following them through the build-up, climax, and the aftermath. This is how you immerse your audience. The build-up isn't just about building tension across a season, it's about building tension across the episode itself. Battles would later be restricted to the second half of an episode, then later in Hot D, the last 15 or 20 minutes, and later it would get even worse. So let's have a look at the battles in House of the Dragon in terms of build-up. Well, there is none. The Battle of the Stepstones occurs in the third episode of the show, where we've still not even been introduced to most of the characters. The Battle of Rook's Rest suddenly happens in Season 2 Episode 4 with very little build-up. We get a few mentions of Rook's Rest in the episodes prior, but that's the extent. Then the Battle of the Gullet was episode 1 of season 3, where the audience has spent 2 years forgetting who everyone is and what's meant to be happening. But more importantly, what are the stakes in these battles? First off, we simply haven't spent enough time with any of these characters to truly care about them that much. For the Stepstones, we've known Daemon for 2 episodes. In that time, he's mocked his brother's dead infant, stolen the dead infant's dragon egg, cut off the penis and hands of random civilians, groomed his underage niece, and beat the ever-living shit out of some poor messenger for handing him a piece of parchment. And on the other side, we have a malformed, faceless reptile who's feeding men to crabs. And what is the battle for? A few islands that we've never seen before and will never see again. At the Battle of Rook's Rest, what is at stake? The lives of Rhaenys, Aemond, Criston, and Aegon. Rhaenys, who just massacred hundreds of innocent civilians 4 episodes prior. Aegon, enjoyer of child death matches and forcing himself on women. Aemond, the one-eyed murderous freak. And Criston Cole, maniacal, raging incel. We've not spent enough time with any of these characters, and none of them really have that much of a redeeming value. Losing any one of these people right now would not even equate to our reaction at Ygritte's death in Season 4. In many Game of Thrones conflicts, whoever wins, we lose, but in Hot D, whoever wins, we don't really care. And while we're on the subject, I just wanted to talk about the complete mistranslation of events during Rook's Rest. In the battle, there's a weird part towards the end where Rhaenys is about to leave, and suddenly turns around to go back in. In the book, the line reads, "Princess Rhaenys made no attempt to flee. With a glad cry and a crack of her whip, she turned Maelys towards the foe." But what they did in the show was completely different. It's extremely odd watching her escape the battle completely able to leave, and then having this scene try to evoke this sense of one final charge and going out with a bang because there's no other option. There is another option. You could just leave. The way that they've staged the scene makes it look like she can just sort of fly away, but the book says she made no attempt to flee. So in that case, all you have to do is keep her doing what she was already doing. That's what making no attempt to flee means. Not finding yourself in a position to flee and then turning back around to fight again. It's very jarring, and the battles are filled with moments like this. They often fail to convey what it is they're trying to get across. In the BTS for the Battle of the Stepstones, the showrunners say it was very important to them to see Daemon fail.
And I think what was most important about it, we needed to show Daemon fail before he succeeds.
It's got to be about him going and losing.
But that battle doesn't come across like that at all. When Daemon eventually gets overwhelmed by hundreds of soldiers, inevitably, the Valyrian forces ambush, and it seems like that's all part of the plan. Anyways, while I've just praised the Battle for the Wall, this is actually where a lot of the tropey Hollywood battle moments began. In one way, I see fights like Tormund versus Alliser as a strength, but in another, they're a weakness, because we have too many coincidental 1v1s between main characters. Ygritte killing Pip, Ollie killing Ygritte, Jon versus the Magnar of the Thenn, Alliser versus Tormund. This then happens again in Hardhome, where Jon has a 1v1 with the White Walker, and again in the Battle of the Bastards, where Tormund has a fight with Small Jon Umber, and Jon has a 1v1 with Ramsay. We also have the main character looking cool, doing front flips and rolling around in slow motion, fighting swarms of soldiers as a one-man army, defying the odds while each soldier politely waits their turn and approaches one at a time. And we have the prioritization of spectacle over character. This will become very prevalent in Hardhome and Battle of the Bastards. Now look, I actually love these battles. I just think they're cool, but they do have many flaws. There is a point where Game of Thrones action just starts to feel like regular action, and it's carried over into House of the Dragon, like Daemon slaying hordes of soldiers by himself in the Stepstones, or in Season 3 Episode 2, where he and Rhaenyra literally stormed the Red Keep alone. That was their plan, to just go in as a two-man army. It's mind-numbingly stupid, and it's not in line with the stakes as we've come to understand them in the world of Game of Thrones. Daemon takes out any soldiers that get in their way, soldiers who, again, very kindly wait their turn to be slaughtered, so he doesn't get too overwhelmed.
I suppose that depends whether I win or lose.
This happens again in the same episode with Aemond. Now, I could be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure we've never actually seen him kill someone with his own two hands. It's only ever been while riding Vhagar. So this is a perfect opportunity to give weight to this scene. Aemond's been built up as this rather one-dimensional villainous murderer, so in this moment it would be interesting to see him finally experiencing what it's like to take a life for the first time with his own two hands. Not just while riding Vhagar, but instead we got a collection of lazily choreographed fights where soldiers will wait their turn again and Aemond never seems to acknowledge the feeling of killing anyone. There's been a lot of praise for Ewan Mitchell's choreography performance.
Ewan is unquestionably our best cast fighter, I think, on the show.
And while I'm sure he's more than capable of doing these fight scenes, we've seen a glimpse of it in earlier seasons, I do not see what anyone else is seeing with these fights here.
Unquestionably our best cast fighter.
The world of Ice and Fire, and Game of Thrones by extension, has a particular weight during fight scenes because of the realism. Arthur Dayne was one of the finest knights who ever lived, and even he was killed by a little swamp boy who was stabbing him in the back when he wasn't looking. Oberyn Martell was one of the deadliest living warriors in Westeros, but he was ultimately defeated because he let his guard down at a critical moment, and it cost him his life. There are a handful of characters in the history of this world that could plausibly take on multiple foes at once and win. People like Arthur Dayne, Jaime, Brienne, Barristan, the Hound, and even then it would still be a challenge. This is what makes it so impressive, because in the real world, when you're outnumbered in a fight, no matter how good you are, the odds are stacked against you. But on occasion, it does happen. And the same is true for Game of Thrones. So on the rare occasions where a hero defies all the odds, it gives it that much more weight. That's what gives the world realism. But it becomes impossible to maintain realism when you see Daemon Targaryen staring down an army of soldiers on his own. When Daemon and Aemon can survive these kind of odds, the idea that anyone could die at any moment feels redundant, and it lowers the stakes. The obsession with spectacle has vastly outweighed any focus on character. We get tons of VFX, endless amounts of pointless dragon shots, flying around and burning things, huge copy and paste VFX armies, backgrounds filled with VFX castles and mountains. There's so much grandeur and spectacle, and yet all of it feels empty. And the industry's over-reliance on the volume is really going to date things in years to come. But it's so much easier to accept the uncanny valley of a scene when you're immersed through character. The Battle of the Blackwater was clearly on a budget, right? Stannis is confined to this little sliver of wall for the entire thing, and there's really not that many soldiers compared to the books. And it cut out the chain sequence, where Tyrion has a giant steel chain lifted out across the bay, ripping through the hull of Stannis' fleet. In the book, we follow Davos from his POV, jumping across the sinking ships as wildfire rains from above him. To this day, it's my favorite action sequence from the entire series, but it was completely cut. But this is an acceptable cut to me, because the episode understood what was most important and resolved to stay focused on that aspect, the characters. Even in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the big battle episode has the bulk of its runtime dedicated to flashbacks that flesh out the characters. If the Battle of the Blackwater was made today by the Hot D team, you could be sure that they would include the big chain, but they would also include an extra 15 minutes of watching the wildfire burn the ships, shrouded in a weird grey CGI mist. Stannis would probably face off against the Hound, the armies in the Red Keep would be bigger and mostly made of CGI, and the battle would have taken up the last 20 minutes of the episode instead of having an entire episode devoted to it. All of this brings us to the battle for the Gullet, somehow the highest rated episode of the show. The Gullet is the culmination of every failure in Hot D so far. First of all, there's no build-up. It's the first episode of a new season, releasing 2 years after the last one. And the first 2 episodes of Season 3 were originally the final 2 episodes of Season 2, but they had to be pushed into the next season because they cost too much money and the budget was mismanaged, which when you look at the other battle episodes, it's very clear that they had no understanding of where to use their money. Alright, there's no build-up across the season, but what about the build-up within the episode? Nope, none at all. It's the most poorly structured battle we've ever had. It's very, very messy. It's constantly cutting away to other characters, destroying any potential momentum.
Dine on the sea snake's ears! Break us free!
Okay, so what about the character stakes? Well, I suppose we care about Corlys a bit, but Alan, not really. He's had like 5 scenes in the show and they were all exactly the same. We've seen him for what, maybe 10 minutes in season 2? We barely know him. And Tywin Lannister we know even less. He's had like 5 lines, let alone 5 scenes. And then we have Lohar. He can't seem to take anything seriously, and it just takes away any potential weight that the battle might have. What makes it even more jarring is that they've made this sudden retcon where it turns out he and Corlys have been arch rivals for years. Jace we do care about to an extent. I mean, we've not spent that much time with him, especially considering his one major plotline was cut from season 2, but we care about him. I think. Jace somehow convinces the Queen's Guard to defy the Queen before going out to battle to prove that he's a man, a real big strong boy. In the books, his younger brothers, who you might have forgotten about because they've barely been seen in the show since season 1, were on a ship heading for Pentos for their safety. This was actually foreshadowed in season 2 of the show when Lady Jane Arryn says they've been put on a ship to Pentos for their safety. They get caught in the middle of the battle, but apparently in the show they just, I don't know, maybe they just got away. but it would be so easy to make Jace's cause more admirable if he was flying into the fray to save his brothers, and it raises the stakes for all involved. After feeling guilt for not protecting one brother, he would feel desperate to redeem himself, making his death all the more tragic. In the book, the Dragon Seeds are also involved in this battle, who Rhaena has replaced, but long story short, the Rhaena stuff is made up, and it sucks. They constantly cut away to her during the battle, so that when she randomly spawns in, it has some justification, but it completely destroys any rhythm or momentum. Why they couldn't have just grouped her scenes together at the start, I don't know. There's also the endless continuous shots of dragons and CGI ships that do absolutely nothing. If you actually add up the runtime of just idle shots watching dragons burn ships, it amounts to a lot of idle time where the plot is not being moved forward at all and we're not even really following any character in particular. They don't add to the battle, they're just an excessive amount of fat, and we get all these weird pointless shots of like the ship underwater, and once again very clearly CGI. And we have this weird sequence where Corlys traps Lohart. Somehow both ships kind of escape the main naval battle and go on a little chase. I don't know what happened there. And then there's a bit where Lohart apparently burns down High Tide off screen, which is a big deal to Corlys, even though he just spent an entire season claiming family was the only thing he cared about. And just as an FYI, down the road from his giant castle is Driftmark, another giant castle that he owns, which I'm pretty sure has been featured in the show. So I don't really get what the point of all of this was. It just seems to take up screen time and budget. None of it added stakes, if that was the intention. But in general, this battle is just so weird. It's choppy, it's disjointed, and all any of the writers are talking about is that it's so big. We set a world record for most number of people on fire on a screen. It's the longest battle ever. We've never done this before. Who cares? The only thing I'll give them is the very final scene of Jace. I think the moment of his death is well done. Although he's still mewing. Even now, he's still mewing. Stop mewing.
What did you call it yesterday?
I get told I'm Mog. Of Mogging,
Just
apparently.
like, you need to teach me about serving Mog.
Action in House of the Dragon is shallow. It doesn't feel real, and it doesn't look real. It has no build-up and no stakes. It's vapid, it's empty, and that's all I really have to say about it. So now we've addressed all the core narrative components, but there's still a few other things we need to discuss. Condal's response to George fanned the flames exponentially, partly because he kept using budget and practical limitations as an excuse for so much disregard of the source material, and because many of Hot D's problems aren't related to the budget. What exposes this even more is when you look at the budget for the early Game of Thrones seasons and Seven Kingdoms. Game of Thrones Season 2 had a budget of around $60 million, roughly equating to $6 million per episode. House of the Dragon's second season is estimated at $160 million, so that's roughly $20 mil an episode. So 3 episodes of House of the Dragon equates to the entire budget for Game of Thrones Season 2. The budget for Seven Kingdoms is estimated at around $10 million an episode, which I actually find a bit baffling considering the scale is a lot smaller than even early Game of Thrones, but it still rounds out to roughly the same budget as Season 2 because there's only 6 episodes. So we can see a consistent pattern here. Whenever the money goes up, the story goes down. And the problem isn't the amount of money, it's how they choose to spend it. So what does $160 million buy you?
Big lizards.
No, lots of things, but VFX are always one of the most expensive elements of any production, and Hot D prefers to showcase dragons and spectacle at the expense of story and character whenever possible. Since Dany's dragons were old enough to fly, HBO's marketing department has peddled them out in every poster and featurette and trailer imaginable. Even the Seven Kingdoms marketing tried to do this sneaky little trick by adding in shots of this wooden dragon spewing fire in every trailer, hoping that a passing glance from a casual viewer would assume the series also includes them. But there's no reason to. Even since the early days, they've misunderstood a key principle. Nobody gives a fuck about the dragons. All the fantasy elements of Game of Thrones are the gravy, but there's no gravy on earth that will save a lumpy mash. Character is why we're here, and the mash must be smooth. Smooth like a table ball. Big lizards aren't the actual problem, they're a symptom of it. As we've already seen with the world building, the writing crew of Hot D suffer from the age-old misconception that bigger means better. They love it when things are big, and they cannot stop talking about it.
You walk around these sets that look like ancient monuments and buildings.
And this model is huge.
That's a massive model to make.
Suddenly we have this huge stadium that we have to fill out.
With massive statues.
Huge, great dome.
It has over 2,000 LED screens.
It still has that scale and scope.
Flexibility to enlarge and enhance.
And then when you come in, it's always
twice the size you imagined it.
And it gradually gets bigger and bigger. And
how big do we make it?
It's so big. It's unbelievable.
It's the biggest TV show.
It was just big.
So everything is big.
I think we could have gone a bit bigger, to be honest.
It's huge, that sequence.
One of the taglines that kept popping up from Condal and Sapochnik in Season 1 is this idea of capturing the feeling of the Westerosi Golden Age at the height of Targaryen power in a more magical era. An age of decadence and opulence and the pride before the fall. And all of that's well and good, but when your story gets slow and the audience loses interest, nobody really cares how many pointy sticks are scattered around the Iron Throne. Nobody cares about your special table balls or your big CGI copy and pasted crowds or your giant fuck-off seashell in the Driftmark throne room. Much like with late season Game of Thrones, the package continues to get prettier, but the gift rots from the inside. Now, George has always encouraged them to go as big as possible wherever they can, and always resented having to scale down his epic fantasy story in any way. He's even admitted in the past that he intentionally designed the books to be unadaptable, which has clearly backfired.
The trick with the show is when you go big, you have to go really big, but you can't go big everywhere.
No, you don't. You don't have to go big all the time, or even at all.
Size and scale and all that is irrelevant, really. It's what you get right with it.
The most memorable battles in Game of Thrones were the ones severely limited by budget and scope. The climactic Battle of Seven Kingdoms doesn't actually have that long of a runtime in terms of physical action. It's primarily devoted to character development. The production team do have this twisted idea of scope and its importance, but it's further fueled by George, and I don't think he appreciates just how much the original series benefited from toning his world down. Budget limitations meant locations and costumes remained grounded and more comparable to historical fiction than epic fantasy. I think this was a hugely significant factor that helped Game of Thrones become more accessible to casual audiences and eventually break into the mainstream. Now, don't get me wrong, I love book accuracy, as you can probably tell. I love all the more eccentric heraldry and the castles and the vivid colors. I love when the world and the history has elements of magic to it, but I think early Game of Thrones struck a perfect balance. Like in Hot D, do we really need a tourney that big? How do the people at the back even hear him talking? I mean, investing so much time and money in the tourney set alone, only to use it once, is ridiculous. That's such a waste of money.
When I first read about the tournament, I thought, oh, it's going to be in a field with some trees around it, and maybe there'll be some flags.
Really, Jim? Have you got the money to build that? And he goes, yeah. Should never have listened to.
I wanted that to be the dominant part of the arena, and it was quite a costly thing, that box.
I mean, I feel like no one told them that that isn't how films are made now, that you don't have to build the whole castle.
We've seen Dragonstone in Game of Thrones, so there's not much to be gained from turning it into a giant CGI-infested soundstage. VFX eats the budget whole. They are one of, if not the most expensive element in any production. And when I was rewatching the series for this video, I quickly noticed the ridiculous amounts of unnecessary expensive VFX shots and countless sequences that don't further the story in any way at all. Making pointless dragon shots is slightly more creative than directly putting your money through the paper shredder. But what makes things worse is this highly infectious mental condition that's causing all the nobility of Westeros to leave doors open for no reason. Doors that have expensive volume screens on the other side, which you wouldn't have to spend money on if some of these pricks just closed the door after them. Then we have countless conversations set in big rooms filled with CGI, or outside with more big CGI. Just move the conversations into a different, smaller, real-life room with no VFX, or even just change the camera angle. Change the camera, move it to a room, close the door, cut the dragons, cut the terrain shots. It's that simple. I do feel a bit crazy just for suggesting that you should move your scene into a normal room. Why is that something I even have to bring up? Is that just not allowed anymore? Look, only a madman would go through the entirety of Season 2 episode by episode and list every single scene that wastes money on pointless VFX. So Episode 1, the very first scene at the wall, super expensive nostalgia bait, and a faithful adaptation could have contained this to a few rooms and a weirwood tree, so just move it to a room. Then we have a pointless dragon shot with Rhaenys. The next scene is in a dragon pit filled with CGI, just change it to a room. Then we have pointless dragon shots of Rhaenyra while she searches for Luke, then more expensive pointless location shots. 10 seconds later, the door's open, close the door. Pointless dragon shot of Vhagar returning, close the door. Pointless dragon shot, then volume background for the throne room. Why are we doing this? We had a real throne room 15 years ago. Then we're pissing away a bunch of money on these shots of CGI ships just to show that Mysaria has been captured. You could literally just have told a guard that she was found hiding in a ship, but anyway, things are okay for the next 4 minutes, and then pointless dragon shot, pointless dragon shot, pointless dragon shot, expensive location shot, about 500 pointless dragon shots with this stupid Baylor chase scene, then expensive location shot. More again, then another one here. Why do we need that castle? We don't need it. Pretty sure this doorway is CGI, just close the door. Then the Rhaenyra handmaiden scene. Just tell her to go to King's Landing, don't waste time watching her walk to the ship, sail there, and walk through the streets. Now we're back to the twins. Why are we having this meeting in the middle of a bridge? Go inside, just move it to a room. Tons of needless CGI at Harrenhal. Make this a tight shot with practical set design and props to fill the frame. Oh wait, more bad VFX here. Then we have more needless VFX on Harrenhal, and then more volume background screens for needlessly large rooms. Just move it to a normal room, close the door, VFX castle. You could move this to a room, or you could literally just change the camera angle so it's facing the sea. Pretty sure that's the volume, change the camera angle or move it to a room. Pointless expensive VFX location shots and fake CGI statues. You can make these statues out of polystyrene for a fraction of the price and have them look real. Then we have Rhaenyra flying out on a dragon. You don't need to show her mounting it, you could just cut. Just more money for no reason. Oh, close the door. Expensive VFX clouds. Just use the normal outdoors. Close the door. Cut this whole sequence with Ulf flying over King's Landing and the weird chase with Aemon, and you could even cut this aura farming shot. Yes, it's cool, but it would be even more cool if we had a show that wasn't bad. More expensive location shots, shit CGI monkey, pointless location shot, pointless location shot, pointless dragon shot, dream sequence full of VFX, pointless dragon shot, close the door. Shitload of money pissed away here on CGI and extras and locations showing us armies heading towards a battle which we already know. Pointless dragon shot, close the door, pointless dragon shot, move it to a room, close the door, close the door.
Open the door!
No, close the door.
Open the fucking door!
No. Thank you. Pointless location shot, pointless dragon shot, move it to a room, pointless dragon shot, close the door, stop mewing, table ball. Why have we lost the ability to put scenes in normal rooms without VFX? Why can't we just put them in rooms? And why have we still not learned how to do those dragon saddle green screen shots without them looking like absolute slop? They're so immersion breaking, and I just feel completely taken out the scene when you have all these dragons fighting each other in what's meant to be climactic battles, and then everything just suddenly looks like they're sitting in a room with some crap volume screen behind them. There are many pointless dragon shots and many expensive location shots that have tons of VFX and fake castles and fake mountains, and they could easily be altered or removed entirely and half the cost of the show. Even in season 1, this was a massive problem. I mean, just look at this pointless, weird dance flying thing with Daemon and Laena. I mean, they thought it was a better use of screen time to watch them flying around and fucking about for ages, instead of giving them more character-driven scenes together with actual dialogue. And look, even if you're gonna have tons of dragon shots anyways, can you at least make ones that further the story and the characters? In the book, Helena loves riding her dragon. It was one of the only times she could be away from the stresses of her life and feel free. Similar to Aegon, she had a beautiful relationship with Dreamfire. The relationships with their dragons are defining parts of who they are. But now...
Helena? She does not ride. She has no taste for it.
Oh, well, that's great. That's fucking great. That's another fucking thing right there.
They love putting dragons on screen, but they don't like exploring the relationships between the dragon and their rider. They're either pissing about in the background or being ridden somewhere. So even when they waste money, they're wasting it wrong. They found a way to waste money more wastefully. I think the dragons in general would be better as an implied threat. We don't get to see them too much. The absence of the thing can make it more fearsome. You build it up in your mind, and it makes the moments when they are on screen feel a lot more momentous, like we've earned it. For the tourney in season 1, they refused to use the set more than once because they went too big and it cost them an amazing 4th episode. But they've doubled down on the expensive set for the Driftmark shipyard. And then they shoot the same scenes there over and over again to get good use out of it. But that just made it feel repetitive. If you relocated some of the Allen stuff to a room or a tavern or a beach or literally anything else, you could have saved a ton of money and had the scenes feel slightly less repetitive. Look at all of the establishing location shots. Look at how long they go on for. Now, it's often customary to have a location shot when introducing a new scene, just to remind everyone of where you are and what characters you're going to be with. But all of these location shots are ridiculously huge, expensive CGI shots, and they go on for so long. Look at the timer here. Let's just say you did an 8-second location shot, right? That's too long, you don't need it that long. If you cut that down to 4 seconds, you have halved the CGI budget for that shot. It's such a frivolous use of money. I know you're gonna say I'm nitpicking, but I'm doing this to show that you can save money in these areas so that you can free up screen time and more money to invest in other aspects of the show later on. Another good example of what I'm talking about is in the season 2 finale, where Rhaenyra flies to Harrenhal to meet with Daemon. Now, the only objective of these next few shots is to communicate that Rhaenyra has gone from Dragonstone to Harrenhal, but look how much time they spend showing that on screen. So first you have a big CGI shot with CGI dragons, then another shot of CGI dragons with Caraxes. Then we cut to another shot of Rhaenyra with tons of CGI armies on her dragon. Then a bad saddle shot. Now another shot of a pointless CGI dragon flying across the armies. Now a huge shot of a CGI location and 2 CGI dragons as she lands. Now another bad dragon saddle shot. Then another shot with CGI dragons and CGI armies and CGI terrain. Simon Strong now meets her outside the castle. Big expensive location shot. Now another shot with big castle and dragon CGI. Cut back to Rhaenyra, more VFX on the dragon and the armies. Back to Simon Strong, big CGI castle. Back to Rhaenyra, CGI dragon and CGI armies in the background. Again, back to Simon, back to Rhaenyra, back to Simon, CGI castle and CGI dragon, CGI armies. Now we open a door with a shitload of volume CGI. And we haven't closed the door, meaning the volume is once again in the background with tons of expensive CGI. Now I don't know how much money that scene would have cost, but I imagine a lot. And it lasted for 1 minute and 54 seconds. And what did it communicate? That Rhaenyra has arrived at Harrenhal. What if Daemon was in a room, okay? And then someone comes into the room and says, dragons have been sighted heading towards the castle. Then Simon Strong meets Rhaenyra at the entrance, indoors, in a room. You could do that in what? 30 seconds? No CGI dragons, no expensive CGI armies or location shots. It's that simple. Think back on all the changes I've highlighted in this video and think back on all the things that have been cut. Changing Laena's death to Dragonfire shoots up the cost, it deviates from the book and it takes up more screen time. And they think it's fine to include that stuff, but then cut the one scene where Daemon consoles his children, which actually builds character. But no, we need Laena to go out like a warrior. Dying in childbirth isn't traumatic enough.
We've already had one person die sort of in their childbirth bed, and I just felt like Laena doesn't go that way. She's gonna go out like a warrior.
Then we cut Jace's storyline at the wall, but at least we got an absolutely pointless scene of Baelor chasing Kristen through the woods. We cut Maelor from the show entirely and removed a major future subplot. We cut Nettles, one of the most important characters in the story, but at least we got to watch Rhaena run around a few hills, and we get to see Alan rehash the same conversation with Corlys 5 times, and Daemon's 5-episode long struggle with insomnia, stop mewing. These are just a few examples, so perhaps you can see why it's so intensely frustrating when Condal uses budget as a justification for deviating from the source material and making terrible changes. He's not saving time by cutting anything because they're filling up that time with a bunch of made up stuff. He's not saving any money by refusing to cast a new child actor for Maelor. He's actually just prioritizing the budget on shots of dragons flying around. Producers and executives and writers will always tell you it's so much more complicated than you understand.
Television just moves. It's a giant moving train, and it's very heavy. And the demands of television are great and heavy, and sometimes it's beyond even the showrunner.
That you're not on the production team and there's so many elements you haven't considered.
The season 8 thing goes, I guess you all saw it from the outside, whereas I saw it from the inside.
Television is a collaborative medium. It's not a single media art form. You're dealing with multidisciplinary, it's a multimedia job. There are writers, directors, there are actors, there's art department, costume designers.
They'll add layers upon layers of contrived reasoning.
It's an incredibly complex and lengthy and intricate process. And
realities of reality, practicality, budgets, what you can and cannot do with small children. All of those things kind of come into play.
And they're doing this to overcomplicate the problem and disable you from making logical criticisms. So know this. It is a basic fact that if you spend less money on shots of big CGI lizards and less time on needless scenes that barely progress the story, you will save money. That's just economics. They'll tell you it's not true and there's so much you can't see behind the curtain. But it is true, and they're scared to be seen as stupid because they're burning money like wildfire. And when the solution to such a gargantuan mistake is painfully simple, you often find the first move of any of these execs and showrunners will be to try and overcomplicate the problem. But it's not that complicated. When a random person on Reddit can think of things that a professional writer can't, suddenly we begin to realize that there's no difference between us and them. And it raises the question of why these people have been employed to write this instead of others. And if their bosses realize that, it will threaten their livelihood. Budget was so much of an issue on season 2 that the final 2 episodes were cut entirely and pushed into the beginning of next season, robbing us of the climax and making season 3 have a very jarring start. Budget affects pacing, pacing affects action, character affects stakes, stakes affect action. George creates Ryan, Ryan destroys George, Ryan creates dinosaurs. Sorry, losing sanity at this point. Stop mewing. House of the Dragon's issues don't exist in isolation. Some of them create a domino effect, causing others to fall down. Or as George said, This is a good time to finally talk about the changes to Blood and Cheese and Maelor the Missing, as outlined in George's blog post. It best illustrates this idea of the butterfly effect. He eloquently broke down the issue and explained it in terms that anyone can understand. Now, it's a lengthy post, so I'm going to condense what he said and try and maintain as much of his wording as possible. So obviously in Season 2, there's the big murder with Blood and Cheese. In the show, Aegon and Helena have 2 kids, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera. Blood and Cheese force her to tell them which one is a boy, although as George points out, there is a much quicker way for them to check, which is kind of dumb when you think about it, because these guys are willing to kill a child. I mean, they're obviously not going to have a problem checking which one is a boy in the most obvious way. Helena tries to save the kids by offering them her necklace and riches, but finally tells them which one is the boy. But in the book, things are different. Aegon and Helena have 3 kids, Jaehaerys, Jaehaera, but also Maelor. And Helena is forced to choose between both of her sons, but she offers her life instead. They refuse, so she ends up picking Maelor, her rationale being that she didn't want to split the twins apart. At which point, Blood kills Jaehaerys instead, and Cheese goes up to Maelor and mocks him, saying, "Your mother wanted you dead." This is clearly more shocking and powerful. George argued against the changes made, but Condell cited budget and the limitations of hiring child actors and assured him they would include Maelor later on. And what annoys George even more is not so much Maelor himself, but how they robbed Helena of her most heroic moment in the book, where she tries to sacrifice herself to save her children, instead of offering them money. But what's more important is how this affects the story moving forward. Later on in the book, Alicent charges Sir Rickard of the Kingsguard to escort Maelor from King's Landing to the Hightower armies for his safety. On the way, they're discovered at a tavern and viciously hunted down and killed. Now, this subplot will probably be mostly cut or simplified. George says it's simplest, yes, and it may make sense in terms of budget and shooting schedules, but simpler is not better. The Bitterbridge scene has tension, suspense, action, bloodshed, and a bit of heroism, and a lot of tragedy. Rickard Thorne is a tertiary character at best, and most viewers will never know he's gone, but I rather liked giving him this brief moment of heroism, a taste of the courage of the loyalty of the Kingsguard, regardless of whether they're black or green. Now, Sir Rickard is this guy in the show. You might have noticed 1 or 2 changes.
It seems Sir Rickard has betrayed me. We must stand down the sentries on the battlement and...
Now, forget about Rickard Thorne for a sec, okay? This would have been a perfect role for Harold Westerling. His inclusion in Season 1 is show only. In the book, he's been dead for years by the time of the Green Council. So that change to me indicated that they had another role for him in the future of the show. He was clearly meant to resemble Sir Barristan, and it didn't really make sense that one of the Kingsguard fled the Green Council to go and pledge fealty to Rhaenyra, while Harold just kind of dropped off the map completely. That was so weird, but regardless of that, you could have used him here. We have an attachment to that member of the Kingsguard, and he could have begrudgingly continued his duties and have that heroic moment. Now, without getting into spoilers, I'll say this. Maelor's death becomes the determining factor that triggers Helena's most significant moment in the story. A moment that becomes a catalyst for further major events that traces all the way down to the final moments of the Dance of Dragons. If you now sub in Jaehaera for Maelor, it starts a whole nother butterfly effect again because she has another role to play. It's basically impossible. Butterflies continue to ripple through the story, and 100 smaller changes add up to something completely different. Just think, like, this is one of the smaller changes they've made. How can you hope to maintain the story's identity when something as significant as this is one of the least notable changes in Season 2? Think back on what I've said about budget, the pointless dragon shots, the needless VFX locations. Think back on the mud fight with Lohar, the repetitive Daemon scenes, the Alan scenes, the Mazzaria scenes. Think of the 30-minute sequence for the Battle of the Stepstones, or the entire hour spent looking for Aegon in King's Landing. You couldn't bring yourself to cut any of that, but you thought it was okay to cut this. This has never been about budget or practical limitations to Condell and the writing team, and they just want to make stuff up and put that in the story and make it their own, but they are just fucking up, loudly and often. Then we have examples of how failing to understand each narrative component can work in tandem and begin to stockpile. It's like an intricate self-reinforcing system of failure. The misuse of each component complements another one in a way that's so calculated it almost feels by design. Now, earlier I was teasing this big change to Criston Cole's character in episode 4 and his meltdown at the wedding being one of the most hurtful changes in the entire show. What actually happened in the book was that Viserys held a tournament to celebrate Rhaenyra and Laenor's wedding. At this tourney, Laenor gives his favour to Joffrey Lonmouth, Rhaenyra gives hers to Harwin Breakbones, and Alicent gives hers to Criston Cole. Cole is described as fighting with a black fury throughout the whole tournament, winning every duel until he comes face to face with Harwin, who likely had already begun his relationship with Rhaenyra by this point. Cole breaks his collarbone and shatters his elbow, breaking the bones of the breakbones. Then he goes on to fight Joffrey and kills him in battle. This could have been the best episode of the season by a mile. It could have been the best episode of the show. Had they better handled Kristen's sudden meltdown at Rhaenyra's rejection on the boat, we'd feel sorry for him and perhaps even root for him in this tourney. But instead of making Rhaenyra lose interest of her own free will or just reject him out of impulsivity, they have to make her seem like a good guy by using the excuse of Aegon's prophecy. She can't run away because she has to protect the throne, and this conversation is stupid on both ends. But in this episode, we could have seen the start of her relationship with Harwin, as well as Cole beginning his relationship with Alicent. We could have followed this knight bathing in external glory and adoration from the crowds, while internally struggling with an existential crisis, with intense feelings of heartbreak and guilt, being praised by king, council, and small folk alike, knowing that he's broken all of his vows. This is a powerful narrative contrast, and it would have maintained his arc having a moral descent, but also painted Rhaenyra a little less sympathetically. Killing Joffrey would have still been tragic and brought a swift end to the festivities as it did in the book, but it would have been much more justifiable. But a king's guard suffering a mental break at a wedding, then savagely murdering a noble, surrounded by witnesses and putting the king's daughter in danger, would be immediately stripped of their rank and sent to the wall or killed. Alicent's protest after her father's removal from office would have been far more hard-hitting if she was retaliating through Cole's victory in the tourney. By giving him her favour, it's her way of expressing her support for him, and he becomes her instrument, which thereby adds shades of colour to her character as she's learning she can weaponize men to carry out her bidding for her because the patriarchy won't allow her any power of her own, so she's learning to use it against them. But what did we get instead? We got Cole crashing out at a wedding and Alicent wore a green dress. A protest so subtle that Harwin and Larys basically have to turn to the camera and explain why it's so slay.
The beacon on the high tower. Do you know what colour it glows when Old Town calls its banners to war?
Green.
Why did Alicent Hightower wear green?
It's to represent the Hightower family at the wedding, to be like,
Yes.
I stand as a Hightower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, hold your horses, Condal. I know what you're going to say. Budget. Way too much money. We already did a tourney in episode 1. Yes, you did, and the behind-the-scenes interviews tell us that you spent an overwhelming amount of money and time on this sequence. So why build the entire set and spend a fortune VFX copy and pasting every crowd member into the scene if you're only going to do this once? It's not economical. This is the age of grandeur. Yes, George desperately wanted you to capture the scale of these tourneys, but far more is lost than gained by making these tourneys stupidly big. Scale down the first tourney and have enough budget to do both of them. It would also highlight Viserys' character. He's a king known for shunning his duties in lieu of festivities. Hosting multiple tourneys plays into that aspect. So a misuse of budget on needless VFX, too much filler content, and an obsession with scale meant changing this episode. It meant condensing important character turning points into single scenes that suddenly turn lovable heroes into wicked villains. It forces important relationships to be pushed off screen. It removes the chance to add complexity to 4 key characters, making them less authentic, which in turn lowers the stakes. And the whole episode overall stifles the pacing. That's just example 1. Then there's Jace's Cut Winterfell arc, and me mentioning that is getting about as repetitive as the Corlys Allen scenes at this point. They spent too much money on the wall because they wanted it to feel like Game of Thrones due to a lack of identity, and it ruined the pacing because some plots are rushed, making others feel like a drag. It removes the chance to flesh out Jace into an authentic character who we care about, which lowers the stakes. And it means Jace doesn't get delayed reports of Luke's death, which would have given it a longer lasting impact in the story, which also lowers the stakes. We have Aegon's prophecy, the result of a lack of identity causing a need to tie into the main series. It's used to morally vindicate characters in moments when they act immorally, reducing their character complexity, which lowers the stakes. Now Rook's Rest fails to reach the heights of classic Game of Thrones action because poor pacing meant no build-up, which lowers the stakes. It follows unlikable characters, which also, can you guess, lowers the stakes. And Rhaenys is less likable because of her dragon massacre in episode 9, which was a poor use of budget. Now, in Season 3, we have the Battle of the Gullet, but poor use of budget meant it had to be pushed to next season, which worsens the pacing. It will have very little build-up, lowering the stakes, and it will feature Jace, but we cut the part that makes us care about him, thereby making him a less authentic character and once again lowering the stakes. A well-oiled machine of unadulterated fuckery, programmed to generate an idea that triggers 7 different interlocking mechanisms designed to systematically destroy any opportunity to craft a compelling narrative. A network of delicately interwoven circuits with the explicit intention of working in unison to cut off any surge of electrical current that might give this show power. You could not have accomplished this fundamental misunderstanding of the prose if you had tried. It's almost impressive. Please. Please stop mewing.